Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. By Ivisor. Chapter 61. Guildmaster. In the afternoon Seth had just finished the fourth blade and quenched it in the water when Finn suddenly came rushing into the armory. She excitedly started talking like a waterfall. Seth. Finn knows now where the old guildmaster is hiding. Finn used her impeccable interrogation skills to have old man Jenkins tell her. She is called Yudrid and is hiding somewhere in the old district. Does Seth remember? The maze-like part of this town. That's where she is somewhere. While talking at high speed she was flying around him like a wasp on cocaine. She must have been very proud. Wait. Yudrid? Yudrid Dawnblade? Finn, that's the huntress who dismantled the Titanoboa for me. And Aso's adoptive mom, parent? Whatever, Seth added to the flood of words falling from the fairy's mouth. She stopped immediately. You already know her. That's great. Then it should be easy to give her the book. Yeah, let's go right now. I have the way on my map and I'm fairly certain we can get there without Aso. He said confidently as he packed away the blades he had just made. Thanks to the map he could now easily find the way without any help after having visited the shop several times. He had also used AutoMap and was horrified by the complexity of the old district. Even with the map, he managed to get lost. With Aso he had reached the workshop in a quarter of an hour. With the map they walked for 45 minutes until they reached the shop. There it is, Seth commented as they finally stood before the big doors of Yudrid's warehouse. He wanted to knock against the door and it slowly swung open as his knuckles hit the wood. It was not locked. Weird was written on Finn's and Seth's face as they looked at each other. Please don't let it be another adventure. Seth was fed up after that random dungeon showing up. The big storeroom was empty and dark. The flickering of a candle could be seen from the door leading deeper into the shop. Maybe something happened? Finn flew up above into the darkness while Seth slowly walked towards the door. Behind the door was another warehouse filled with shelves and unassuming boxes. A burnt-down candle was desperately fighting to stay lit during the last moments of its life. I stood on a writing desk with an open book. The book was filled with alternating neat and sloppy handwriting. Probably the inventory list. At the edge of the candle's flickering shine, barely visible in the twilight beyond laid a collapsed figure. Oh Finn's god! Is it dead? Finn exclaimed tactfully as she could not identify what the messy dwarf crumbled on the floor was supposed to be. Seth crouched down to check on her and as if on cue the messy dwarf let out a massive snoring. A little further away at the foot of a shelf was an emptied bottle of booze. It must have rolled away, when Yudrid keeled over. This is our mysterious guild master, Seth explained. Finn was skeptical, looking at the deafeningly snoring female dwarf with a beard drenched in drool and booze. And was that puke on her chainmail? Finn decided to increase her distance a little. She didn't want to be in range, if Yudrid had some more ammunition in her stomach. Hey Yudrid! Wake up! Seth gave her some slaps on the cheek and immediately regretted it. The urge to wash his hand was his biggest problem until the dwarf woke up and emptied her stomach on Seth's clothes. Finn was proud. She had made a wise choice and was not even close to the splatter zone. The fuck? Who woke me up? She looked into Seth's face that was distorted in revulsion. Then at the tiny fairy in the distance. You, what do you guys want? I didn't keep any materials. And Aso already took the carfuncle, so you can have it back. Don't you can mug me with your little fairy thug, she asserted and stood up. Her jittery hands tried to straighten her dirty clothes in vain. Seth blinked a little baffled about her defensive reaction. Was it because she was still drunk? None of that. We are here to give you something, Guildmaster. Yudrid froze when he mentioned her title. It had been ages since someone had called her that. Despite doing her best to wipe away those memories with alcohol, everything came back with just these two words. Her face turned really dark and rigid. They could hear her teeth grinding. Don't call me that. I am not the Guildmaster anymore. She walked up to the writing desk and took another bottle of booze from the drawer. Unfortunately, our quest says otherwise, Finn said seriously. The fairy had turned solemn upon seeing the dwarf's reaction. Yudrid sighed. All right, gimme whatever it is and get lost, she gestured at Seth to give her item. Seth took the guild log from his inventory and handed over to the guild master in denial. Ding! You have completed the quest Guildmaster's last request. You have earned experience. Ding! You have leveled up. You are now level 18. He was back to level 18. Great. This is, Yudrid took the book covered in dried blood with shaking hands. She opened it and read a few sentences. Even after a decade she recognized the handwriting in the log. Where did you? She looked up at the young man she had puked on and his fairy guard. We came through Ivisor and found it in the old guild branch. You should read the last page. Yudrid had put away the booze and held the book in both hands as the schemed through the pages. When she reached the last ones, tears started to well up in her eyes. They wiped away her tears. This stupid idiot was never good in dealing with sudden situations. Her tears dropped on the blood-covered pages. She wiped them away and some of the blood came off too, revealing another sentence. I am sorry, Mom. All dams broke and Yudrid started bawling her eyes out. She cried and snuffled in between sobbing. Mom. What's going on? Asso had come in and saw the disheveled dwarf sobbing with a book tightly pressed against her chest. Asso walked up and pulled her into a tight hug. He had never seen her lose composure like this. He gave Finn and Seth a sharp gaze before his attention went back to the mourning dwarf in his arms. When Yudrid had calmed down a little she apologized for her reaction. It seemed that this had built up for quite a while. She them thanked for the book after composing herself, but asked them to leave. Although they were interested in what exactly had happened, they were not tactless enough to ask the old guild master to pour her heart out to them. She had Asso for that. The two left the warehouse with mixed feelings, leaving the lizardman and his adoptive dwarven mom behind. They were glad that the quest was finished at last. Well, Seth was happy it was over. Finn now had to find a way to kill time in the next few weeks while Seth worked on the Lord's order. They talked about possibilities on their way back. Finn could go and explore the dungeons, the library, and the city while Seth worked. Or she could return home. This suggestion made the fairy wildly shake her head. She definitely did not want to visit home. They would totally make her a hero and make her do her duties. Or force even more duties on her. No, 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 she was good. She preferred being bored and laze around with Seth, over returning back there. It was dark when they reached the palace. They were in time for dinner. They high-fived and entered the dining room. The Lord and Ikram were already seated at the table. There was also a new face they had not seen before. At the dinner table sat a middle-aged man in long, flowing robes. They were in shades of moss green and black. His head was cleanly shaven and decorated by black tribal tattoos. He had sharp eyes and an obviously evil goatee. He looked like the typical evil sorcerer any cheap fantasy movie likes to antagonize. Ah, you have noticed Megiddo. He's our part-time court wizard, the Lord explained joyfully. Part-time? Finn asked innocently as they sat down. Oh, yeah the Lord started to try and explain, but Megiddo interrupted him. Zhike is my home. Unfortunately, being a wizard is quite costly. Considering the city's situation, I cannot stay here all the time. I have a business in Orote. I travel back and forth and act as a court wizard on a voluntary basis, he explained in a friendly manner and gave them a smile nobody would expect from this kind of character. The Lord had a thankful expression when he looked at Megiddo. It was hard to explain for a noble, that they could not pay their own court wizard. I fathom you are the blacksmith the young master invited, he asked in a friendly manner. Seeing Seth nod over decimating the food on the table, he continued. Do you think I could take a look at your work tomorrow? If you don't mind, of course. Chapter 62. Joint Dungeon Dive. Seth raised his eyebrow. And why would you want that? Oh, please. I don't mean any harm. It's just, no skillful blacksmith has been to Zhike for years and suddenly someone appears and offers to equip the personal guards for a fraction of the market price. And in just a few weeks to boot. You have to understand that I am a little suspicious. What if you are not as skilled as you say, or just run off with the money? Seth thought for a moment about it. Megiddo's concerns were understandable. Seth was very lucky that his appearance was a great help concerning the Lord's predicament. He was desperate and gladly grabbed the helping hand he reached out to him. Megiddo on the other hand had no reason to put his hopes or trust into Seth. Sure, why not? You can come to visit the armory tomorrow, Seth said in between two big bites. He would not let this conversation interfere with his meal. The next morning, Megiddo followed Seth after breakfast into the armory. Megiddo's eyes almost jumped out of their sockets when he saw Seth's smithy. The half-material and half-immaterial crafting stations glowing in a dim blue, the bright soul fire burning in the forge. You are not a simple blacksmith, is that an enchantment table? the wizard mumbled and suddenly called out. His eyes had fallen on the covered in magic formations. Well, it's for engraving and inlays, but yet, it's also to make enchantments. I don't have much experience with it, yet, Seth explained as he brought out the materials to start forging. Your class? Uncommon? Rare, the older man kept asking. I think you are overstepping a little. You just wanted to see me working, so stop asking so much and let me work. With that, Seth concentrated on forging. In the blazing soul fire, the billet reached forging temperatures. Spellbound Megado's eyes were fixed onto the piece of steel on the anvil. Under Seth's experienced strikes, the trivial piece of metal grew in length and width. Before his eyes, it took the rough shape of a sword. He watched it gain a blade profile, a fuller, a taper. Only after an hour, when Seth finally quenched the finished blade of a long sword, did the wizard finally wake up from his trance. Barely an hour had passed. He was surprised. The young man before him had finished a complete blade in just 1 hour. If he really held that tempo, the swords could be ready in just a week. His eyes wandered to the enchantment table. Did he also plan to enchant those weapons? Megado was convinced of Seth's skill and thanked him before leaving the armory. He really just wanted to make sure that he did not scam the Lord. Oh, hey. Before you leave, I also have a question for you, he said while getting the next billet ready. Can you get something for me? The wizard nodded after listening to Seth's request. He promised that he would see what he can do and left the smithy in a hurry. Seth shrugged and started on the next blade. He still had another 25 blades to go. The following week was just as uneventful as he wished. Finn spent her time either watching him or in town. She held off on exploring the dungeons and waited for Seth. On the 4th day, he had finished the last blade and could start engraving. When engraving a new or specific pattern, one would normally sketch it before transferring it to the metal and engraving it using the engraving iron. That's where enchantment shone. In tandem with blueprint, he could project a holographic sketch on the blade. Thanks to his relatively high dexterity compared to the complexity of the circuit, and the assistance given by the crafting station, his first enchantment did not fail. It was not perfect, but it worked, when he tested it using the magic circle. Ding! Skill, enchantment, beginner, leave 1 has become enchantment, beginner, leave 2. The beginning was always easy. Seth fathomed that levels above 5 would be hard to crack with the basic enchantments he had. Anyways, motivated by his first success, he kept going with enchanting. His back hurt and his hand shivered, but after 3 days of engraving, he was finally finished. In the meantime, his enchantment had barely reached level 4. Seth rubbed his hands. Once he finished the handles, he should get a huge chunk of experience in his blacksmith. Seth, are you done yet? You promised we would go to the dungeon today, the fairy whined like a spoiled child. She rolled back and forth on the engraving table and oozed an aura of boredom. There was really not much left to do in town for her, and Seth felt bad for her. He had fun crafting, but Finn was pretty much alone with her boredom. Okay. Let's go. Seth said and stood up. The fairy happily flew around him like a spark of joy and cured his back pain for him as she did so. They wanted to explore the one low-level dungeon in town that was not wet, smelly, or empty. The two wanted to explore the big hole with the maze of tunnels. It would be their first joint dungeon dive. Finn was really excited to fight side by side with Seth. It was her chance to shine a little in front of him. They would enter the deep hole. Their life would not be at risk in a low-level dungeon, so Finn could pose a little and show Seth her true prowess, by mercilessly slaughtering weak mobs. The dungeon was literally just a big shaft straight down with a 20-meter diameter. A staircase without guardrail spiraled down along its rough stone walls and vanished into the darkness below. There were openings to rooms and passageways at random distances along the staircase. Generic undead like skeletons, skeleton archers, and skeleton warriors up to level 10 were supposed to appear in this place. So, the deep dark hole and the dim tunnels did not pose much danger except getting lost in the darkness and maze-like structure. Both were no problems for them with the fairy's light spell and Seth's map. Finn told him that the guild had a device that could download a dungeon's map made with map. If they wanted to, they could sell the map later on. But it was not their main focus. They entered the dungeon with the mindset of explorers. The cool dark cave-like environment was a welcome change to the hot and damp desert city. Seth wore a set of scale armor from the armory he had polished up. He also made a simple mace from high-quality steel. He could only use his experience from video games, but blunt force should work best on skeletons. Heavy mace. Uncommon. Damage, 230. Durability 1500. Requirement, 35 STR. A good weapon made by an aspiring blacksmith. The experienced workmanship tells of great talent. This classic weapon made of superior materials excels in causing blunt trauma. Plus 25% chance to stagger target. Plus 10% chance to knock out the target. The mace had given him a whopping 4% on blacksmith, apprentice, and got his hopes up for the chunk of proficiency he would gain once he started finishing the swords. But Seth didn't really expect to play a big role in the coming dive. Finn was hyped up to show Seth her power as an almost level 50 adventurer after they had to struggle so much on their journey. Despite that, it was a low-level dungeon with skeleton undead. The fairy was in her element as a battle priest. Seth had offered to try and make equipment for her, but she was almost like a monk, so she denied wearing weapons or armor. She only wore robes. Still, in the back of his mind, Seth didn't give up. He could maybe make her accessories once his skill grew more. As they had no set goal for their excursion, the two simply wandered around and explored without minding the map too much. At first the passageways reminded them of mines with low ceilings and roughly hewn walls. This passage was short and it soon started to closely resemble a natural cave. Sometimes the ceilings became very low, so much so that they had to crouch, and other times they were so high, Finn's light could not reach them. They came through caverns with stalagmites and stalactites forming impressive natural columns. Deep chasms like bottomless pits beside the narrow path made the trip more exciting than the possibility of meeting monsters. All they saw until now were normal animals you would expect in a cave, like bats. After walking for maybe 2 hours, they heard a noise that was distinctly different from the surrounding ambient. Their first mob. It was a single skeleton with a bone club just standing in the middle of the tunnel. Its head already exploded the moment it turned towards the light. The fairy with her hand clad in holy aura had easily crushed the mob more than 30 levels below her. Seth did not even have time to use observation on the poor pile of bones. Was this already bullying? The distribution was set so Seth got 90% of the experience. It was the highest setting possible. His experience bar increased an almost invisible amount, maybe 0.5%? If they found enough, maybe he could? What bullying? This was a legitimate hunt. Yes. Go Finn. Go. Another 200 and I get a level up, Seth cheered when another 3 skeletons suddenly ambushed the fairy by jumping down from somewhere in the darkness above. Seth instinctively dispatched the one that landed with a swipe of the mace. The mace crushed through its shoulder blades and spine without even slowing down. When he looked up, the other 2 had already turned into piles of bone powder on the ground. This ambush might have worked on newbie adventurers, but the 2 were just overpowered in this environment. One of the skeletons dropped a tiny soul. Before Seth could walk over to pick it up, the soul floated towards him and vanished. What? He called out. He asked Finn to wait for a moment and checked his status window. Above his money display had appeared a soul display. It currently showed 1 soul, small. The perk list helped him find the culprit. Soul Capture had gotten a new perk on Leave 3. It was called the Soul Space and automatically collected souls around Seth. When he tried to shove the stack of small souls into the display, it increased to 54 soul, small. Like this, the souls would not take up inventory space anymore. With the juvenile's soul, the display showed 1 soul, big, 54 soul, small. Once he had dealt with this joyful surprise, they continued exploring deeper and deeper into the maze of confusing tunnels and caverns without many problems. Chapter 63. The Reach. Under the light of the fairy's magic, the walls sparkled in a mix of green and copper. They had walked deeper and deeper for several hours. They wanted to reach places no one else had before. That's why they used Seth's map to always choose the ways leading down. Finn had taken care of everything and packed rations for several weeks. Which would probably last for a week, if the 2 were honest about the eating habits. They kept making frequent lunch breaks on the way. Anyways, copper and copper ore covered the walls of the tunnel they entered. Was this the explanation for this maze of tunnels? Was it all just an ancient copper mine that connected to a natural cave? No matter how deep they went, undead were spawning very sparsely down here. One would think the mobs would become more numerous or at least stronger the deeper one entered the dungeon, right? On the other hand, they had no idea where the dungeon core or the master would be in this mess of winding passages and rooms. Seth did not really mind, they had been here long enough for him to gain almost 50% of the experience needed to reach level 19. As long as the monsters kept spawning at this rate, he would level up even if they turned back right now. Seth had not brought a pickaxe. But it wasn't a problem. He summoned the forge on a bigger crossing and made a simple pickaxe, netting him 3% proficiency because it was rated uncommon thanks to the steel he used. He had learned his lesson and had also started to carry a stack of wood with him in case he needed to make a polearm like a spear or now, the handle for the pickaxe. No matter how often Finn sees it, it impresses Finn every time, the fairy exclaimed looking at the pickaxe he finished in less than an hour. Why did he suddenly become a miner, you might ask? The better question would be, who would leave free raw materials behind? It was another lesson Seth had learned. Get as much as possible when you still have the chance. All the rebar he missed out on in Deltan because of the rain was a painful reminder. And so, they spent 2 hours excavating the copper vein until Seth had 3 stacks of copper ore and small copper ingots. While Seth was fighting the earth for its resources, Finn took over the duty of farming the mobs that got lured here by the loud noises of steel biting into stone. Together with the mobs who got lured when he made the pickaxe, he had gained another 10% experience. After another lunch break, they started traveling again. Whoa, he could hear the tiny voice of Finn in the front. Up high on the ceiling shone, like dim stars, luminescent crystals and moss. Their light unveiled the full expanse of the great cavern they had just entered. Stalactites and stalagmites formed long and thin columns, making it look as if the night sky itself was flowing down to the earth below. Both, the human and the fairy, stood there amazed with their mouths and eyes wide open. For several minutes they just stood there and took in the sight. Seth felt a little relieved when Blacksmith's eyes didn't show anything in here as a crafting material. He would have hated to damage this place. Should we stay here? It should be late out and Finn is becoming a little sleepy, the fairy brute said, unusually tactful. Seth agreed that this was a great place to take a rest and sleep a little. It reminded the two of the night they met and they talked a lot until they fell asleep, just like back then. Finn had brought an alarm system. It was an uncostly device that would alarm the user if a hostile presence entered the perimeter. But the night was silent and they slept peacefully below the subterranean firmament. They slept better than expected and woke up well rested. They had a small breakfast and packed up their stuff to continue. The starry cavern was soon crossed and their party entered back into the entrails of the earth. Being this deep below earth might have made others panic, but since they had the strength and map to rely on for the way back, they were very calm. Even optimistic. Seth especially, since his copper stack increased to 5. He had no mining skill, but funny enough weapon mastery leveled up to 6 after hours of swinging the pickaxe. Past the starry cavern, the mobs also started to become a little stronger. Skeleton warriors and archers appeared more often and their tactics also slightly evolved. The ambushes were more elaborate and they used the advantages of the archer's range and the warrior's melee prowess. Of course, it was a futile struggle in front of the juggernaut fairy. The tiny berserker easily plowed through any opposition, collecting experience for Seth on the go. If the caves and tunnels didn't look so rough and random, Seth would have likened it to a famous movie adaptation he knew, where the heroes travel through the abandoned mines of an extinct dwarven nation. Unfortunately, there were not as many mobs. Just imagine the level he could reach if they could decimate such hordes of low-level scrubs. A few hours in, after they restarted their journey, the tunnels started changing again. They became more regular. Not the neat kind of regular, but rather disturbing. They reminded Seth of the paths in an anthill. Would the mobs change from here on? Giant insects? Finn did not seem troubled at all. It was likely that no other adventurer had reached this far before, at least the guild had no info about this. His worries seemed unfounded, as they did not even meet a skeleton after entering these tunnels. Maybe the lead away from the dungeon core? It was when they started to relay a little that they reached the reach. This area had its own name as a biome on the map. In front of them expanded a wide open floor. The bottom and ceiling were completely even and parallel. Supporting the ceiling and connecting the two surfaces were almost hourglass-shaped pillars. Pale dim light fell in from the distance, illuminating this bizarre scene and turning everything into pitch-black silhouettes. This was nothing natural. The pillars all looked almost identical and were spaced in regular intervals. The ceiling and floor were completely even and parallel all the way into the distance. This was not natural, but it also didn't look like human hands did this. Where did the light come from, this far below the earth? Seth only found out where they were after zooming out from the immediate position. They had actually traveled a big windy circle downwards. Their current position was close to the entrance to the main shaft, just hundreds of meters below. So, the light came from the big hole's exit. This unsettling floor was where the shaft led to. They were still in shock when they heard a shuffling in the dark. Wa stepped out of the dark was a 3-meter-tall knight wearing a black suit of armor completely hiding his features. He dragged a giant sword behind him, almost as big as himself. Fuck, Finn cursed without holding back and charged the opponent. Her hits easily deformed the knight's black armor, but could not instant kill him like the skeletons before. He used the chance to observe it. Death Knight LV. He didn't get more than the name from observation, but this was more than enough. From what he was told, Death Knight were high-tier undead like Dullahans or Liches. This was a big leap compared to the laughable skeletons they had met until now. Finn was probably able to deal with this guy alone, but it would take a while. More undead could come lured by the sound of fighting, so Seth decided to help. After finding some of them in the armory, he had made about 50 arrows with bodkin tips. Since Finn had his attention, Seth could fire his arrow at pretty much point-blank range. They did not as much damage as Finn's holy fists, but the arrows stuck in the armor and joints majorly impeded its movement and soon allowed the fairy to finish it off. Ding! You have leveled up. You are now level 19. The Death Knight finally crumbled into a pile of dented armor and bones. Seth collected the armor and even found a tiny magic stone the size of a pea. The armor was made of iron and nothing special. It was just very thick, which was why it could take the tiny Terminator's punches. The two stayed alert, looking and listening into the darkness, but all there was silence. No other mob approached. They could have just turned around here. Go back to the guild and inform them about this. Who are we kidding? Obviously, they followed their curiosity and approached the circle of light in the distance. Above them was the circular outline of the shaft's end. Before them was a giant circular hole covered by a transparent pale white barrier, with erratic veins like a membrane or lightning patterns. Visible in the hole beyond the barrier was a dark fog writhing and pressing against the thin membrane as if trying to break out. Mystified by what they had found this deep under the foundation of the city, they were surprised by a scuttle in the darkness. Seth knew this sound. Finn knew it, too. It was something they would not forget any time soon. Chapter 64. Ivisor. Now then, foolish human, has your curiosity been satisfied? A deep booming voice echoed through the darkness in their minds. Both turned around in shock. Ding! You have witnessed the terror of Dungeon Master Serena Bulk Ivisor. Int +1 experience gained. They completely froze. Finn even forgot to fly for a moment and almost fell to the ground. It was almost the same as the holy beast they had seen. Just 5 times bigger. The golden head with a neck frill or shield resembling a scarab and 3 pairs of blue eyes. An upright upper body with 3 pairs of arms ending in sickles like those of a mantis. A body looking like a mix of centipede and millipede covered in snow-white almost ceramic-looking carapace armor with silver markings. A body so long that it vanished somewhere in the darkness behind it. The hundreds of pairs of legs ending in acute tips able to stab into stone a find hold even on the ceiling. Why the ceiling? Behind the dungeon master had appeared more silhouettes in the darkness, some smaller ones clinging to the ceiling. They were surrounded. Has the Nightcrawler stolen your tongue, human? Serena lowered its head the size of a small car and looked Seth in the eyes. Had your curiosity been satisfied? His heart palpitated and his thoughts raced. He used instinctively observation and remembered the announcement just now and... No, he pressed out between his clamped lips. I actually have more questions than ever. Serena lifted his head again and fixated the ant-like human before him. Suddenly a burst of roaring laughter filled the floor and it was illuminated by a huge number of glowing crystals. The reach was flooded by warm golden light, revealing another 20 creatures of its kind who all ogled Seth in an interested manner. Very well, marked one. We also have many things to us. Follow me, it not good to talk here. Baffled Seth's and Finn's mouths stood wide open. The situation kept changing a little too fast for them to adapt. When they finally came back to their senses, they hurriedly followed the group of creatures, that had walked off without caring whether they followed or not. Seth had a guess as to why they survived, but they still had no idea what was really going on. Serena led them to a big cavern at a corner of the reach. The walls were covered with golden shining bronze and a dungeon core was embedded in the center of the room. Serena Bulk curled up around the dungeon core while most of his brethren dispersed. I welcome you to our humble abode, marked one, he welcomed the two when they finally caught up with him. Using Blacksmith's eyes, Seth immediately realized that the whole cavern was covered in a fine web of ancient bronze. Thank you. With marked 1, do you mean the mark of Ivisor in my status? Can you explain this maybe a little more? Seth asked carefully. He didn't want to make any false assumptions, so he took small steps with his questions. Serena hummed and thought of an answer. Has it really been so long, that the world has forgotten about us? He stared into the air for a moment. I guess it has been several millennia and apocalypse since then. I shall explain from the beginning. When this world was created, our god. Arim, could you maybe shorten it? We don't need the whole creation myth of this world, Finn disrupted him hurriedly. She knew this kind of ancient beings. If left alone, they would ramble on for hours. I see. Yes, the mark of Ivisor is something bestowed by us to people of trust. We are the Ivisor, servants created by the god of the sun, Ivis. God of the sun? Nobody mentioned there are still gods in this world, Finn exclaimed. This actually made the giant dungeon master look depressed. He is not with us anymore. Anyways. Human, we also have questions. How did you get the mark? Are there still brethren out there? Although he tried to hide it, there swung a tad bit of excitement in his voice. Seeing him excited made Seth feel conflicted. Should he tell him the truth? Or lie? At this point, he didn't think Serena would kill them. But Seth shook his head. He just told Serena the whole story, starting with how they came to this world and what they had experienced in Ivisor. Still, he had a heavy heart telling him that the Ivisor they met was no more. So, the seal in the capital has already weakened this much. Thank you for ending her suffering, sorrow swung along in his voice. At least this means that there still might be some younglings out there. An awkward silence followed as nobody really knew what to say. In the end, it was broken by Finn. What is the seal you spoke about? She squeaked. What followed was the uninterrupted story of what happened back then. This place, the Reach, actually had a permanent portal to what the system called the Pathwork. Back then, the system had not yet entered this world. From this portal that opened in a simple cavern, came a shapeless entity rivaling their gods in power. It created this shaft when it made its way to the surface. The aura it spread corrupted the living and the dead alike, strengthened them and made them its servants. As it spread, it sucked the life away from this world to gain more power. Back then Ivis, as the god of the sun and light, stepped up to fight it. The god and his followers had to use forbidden magic that turned their once fertile land into a lifeless desert. They managed to seal the entity under the god's temple in the capital. While the weakened god and his followers would stay there in undead slumber to protect the seal, the Ivisor would upkeep the barrier on this portal, so nothing like this would happen again. Finn was right. Serena did not stop after just answering that one question. He forced them to listen to the whole story. It was all too late. It was the beginning of the end. Other gods of the pantheon used the chance to assassinate Ivis and take his divinity. And this led to the god fall. The god led a war against each other to gain more power, which ended with their mutual destruction. About 500 years ago, when this world had been ravaged by the war of the gods, the system appeared and lent a helping hand. And following the system was the god of dungeons. As creations of their god, they denied inclusion into the system. On the other side, they accepted the offer of the god of dungeons. They became part of the dungeon in exchange for the power to protect the seal for all eternity. Although, it did not work so well in the capital. While Serena kept on talking, it seemed like he had millennia worth of dialogue. Seth could not stop studying the bronze covering the walls. Say, did you make this ancient bronze? It was the only possibility he could think of. The energy of the membrane was very similar to what Seth had seen in the ancient bronze. Serena was interrupted in his monologue and needed a moment to react. Why, you mean the holy gold? Who dared to title it a simple bronze? Blasphemy. The system calls it that. So, you made this? How? As an answer, Serena suddenly spat a thin bundle of thread from his mouth against the walls. We feed on copper and tin and mix it with our soul's energy to create the thread for God's garments. Suddenly there was a glint in his 3 pairs of eyes, as if he had an idea. You mention you are a blacksmith, right? Seth was distracted by a notification. Ding! You have discovered the lost origin of a special material. Int +1. He let out a weird mutter neither Finn nor Seth could understand, and a smaller Ivisor brought something in. It was an elongated ball of golden silk. I had looked for a way to transition to this topic. But this might make it a lot easier. What do you mean? Seth was perplexed and didn't he understand. Serena sighed. You know, marked 1, the one disadvantage of living in this dungeon, is that we cannot leave. We keep the number of creatures low, so nobody comes here and disturbs the seal. This also means we can just cause a dungeon break to take a walk outside. Once they are born, they are bound to the dungeon. You see, many of the young ones you see here have never seen the son of our god, he explained sorrowfully. Would you take this young one with you to the surface? I believe you are trustworthy and the child can help you make holy gold, too. Isn't that a good deal? The blacksmith and the fairy looked at the small cocoon Serena had put into Seth's arms with wide open eyes. Chapter 65. Pet? You know, Finn whispered in his ear, maybe you could register it as a pet once you reach level 20. What? Seth and Serena both said at the same time. The giant boss and an unbelievable fine sense of hearing. A pet, really? What do you mean a pet? I will let you know, all offspring inherit the memories of their parent. Don't you think you could treat the child like an animal? Serena said indignantly. Oh. No. That's not how it works, Finn said hurriedly, waving her arms around in a panic. It's like an harem partner system? It only works when both parties agree and can also be broken up at any time, with one disagrees strongly. She explained about the pet system to Serena Bulk. It was a contract that only worked when both parties were willing. It would allow the pet and the player to share experience and create a pet space where the pet could rest or enter so it did not cause a scene in a city, for example. Serena was slowly being convinced. If their offspring could see the sun, he would even allow them to enter this alien system. Seth on the other hand still was not sure. A pet that spits uncommon metal thread might be really cool. And the Ivisor probably was a really strong race, as the direct creations of a god. Weren't they like angels of this world? They also were not ugly. But was it too much for a simple man to dream of a cool pet? The stereotype would be riding a wolf or a lion, right? Or maybe even a ground dragon, if those existed somewhere? Looking at the sparkling cocoon in his hand. It was soft and he felt a soothing warmth from it. Please, he heard a tiny voice in the back of his mind. Well, at least it would be a very unique partner. Seth embraced the cocoon a little tighter. With this, all parties agreed. That only leaves one matter to be dealt with. I still need to reach level 20 to unlock this pet system. Oh, that's easy. Don't you just need to kill a lot of monsters. With this, Seth came into the grotesque situation that a dungeon master kept summoning easy targets to power level him. He just had to stand there and strike down skeleton mages with his sword. Why the sword? Thanks to its effect of increased damage to targets with lower strength, he could easily one-shot the skeleton mages. It was simply faster than the mace. Skeleton mages gave more experience than archers or warriors, so they still gave 0.5% on level 19, if he killed them alone. Which meant he used a little more than an hour to non-stop kill 200 mobs and finally reach level 20. Ding! Inventory has been extended. Ding! New class skill has been unlocked. Check your skill window. Ding! You have completed the quest the next level 3. You have earned new system rights. Ding! You have received a follow-up quest the next level 4. He was all sweaty and his arm felt heavy, but the fatigue vanished when he took a look at his status. Just like Finn had said, there was a new tab in his status window that said Pets. It was actually split into pets and mounts and he had one slot in each of them. He also took a look at his status. Name, Seth Smith. Mark of Ivisor. Title, Faster Than the Thought. Level, 20. EXP, 0%. Race, Orihuma. Sex, male. Age 23. Class, Spirit Blacksmith, unique. Affiliation, System Church. Health, 960/1000. Mana, 190. Strength 55. Dexterity 55. Agility, 38. Intelligence 19. Willpower 35. Endurance 45. Personality 12. Luck 18, plus 10. Free AP, Attribute points 22. Free SP, Skill points 3. Defense. Physical, 185, 135 plus 50, ENDX 3. Magical, 95, 70 plus 25, WILX 2. Fire immunity. There were no major changes to his status. He opted to wait with spending his point this time. He wanted to be careful about it. The greatest change was the jump in and he had gotten. What really made his heart race was the skill window. Blacksmith, Apprentice, Leave 7, 52%. Enchantment, Beginner, LV4. Goldsmith, Beginner, Leave 1. Blacksmith Size Leave 4. Blueprint, Apprentice, Leave 2. Soul Infusion Leave 2. Spirit Smithy Leave 4. Spirit Capture Leave 3. Spirit Forging, Apprentice, Leave 1. Weapon Mastery, Adept, Leave 6, 54%. Calm Reaction, Passive, Leave 7. Fear Resistance Leave 8. Fire Affection Leave 2. Fire Manipulation Leave 8. Map Leave 4. Observation Leave 3. Concealment Leave 4. Spirit Forging. He finally got a skill that explained his class. Spirit Forging. Requires, Karen S. Obel, minimum, uncommon, blueprint added. The core skill of a spirit smith. Create equipment directly from a collected soul. Soul armaments are worn directly on the soul and take up not equipment slot. Soul armor has no durability or physical defense. Soul weapons ignore physical defense and directly attack the soul. Soul equipment can be fused into physical equipment to imitate a permanent enchantment. Requires, Soul Infusion Leave 3. He could directly turn souls into equipment and even fuse it into already finished weapons. He could also wear a second layer of armor just like that. It was also the first skill that actually needed a specific tool. Seth felt that it made sense, that a blacksmith should make and use his own tool at some point. He was completely caught in the system options, so Cerno Bulk and Finn could only watch him gesturing in the air as he interacted with his menus. Karen S. Obel. Uncommon, Growth. Damage, 120. Durability 2000. 1. The hammer grows by feeding on souls and materials. 2 more options will be unlocked as the hammer grows. Like the coin needed to pay the ferryman Karen to bring the souls to the underworld. This hammer is needed for a soul to find a new purpose in the hands of a spirit smith. Karen S. Obel is used to directly forge and damage souls. Requirement, Spirit Smith. A growth item. And he didn't need to go and gain experience with it, but just feed it materials. But now wasn't the time. Seth forced himself to turn his attention back to the giant Ivisor, the small cocoon, and the even smaller fin. Ah, sorry. It worked. I unlocked the pet system. Seth did not plan to overlevel, nor did he feel like slaughters mobs for several hours. So, this concluded their little power level session. The two said farewell to Cerno and left with the small cocoon. Today they had probably learned many secrets of this world few natives could ever imagine, but to them, it was not much more than a nice fairy tale. So, what if there were world-ending powers in this world that needed God to intervene? It wasn't urgent or their world. In the worst-case scenario, they would take the risk of porting back to Earth or the fairy world. Seth grew attached to the little cocoon, thinking about the possibilities his new skill and the little Ivisor gave him. Wouldn't he be able to make scary strong items if he managed to connect all the skills he had? If he could layer the effects of soul armaments, soul infusion, and different enchantments? These were all thoughts for the future when he got his hands on all kinds of enchantments. He didn't fantasize for long. There was no need to care much about the map on their way down, but on the way up he needed to concentrate to find the right way back. After another 2 times of sleeping in the dungeon, they finally reached the surface. They hissed like vampires when the bright sunshine fell into their eyes. The dampness and heat of the air hit them like a wall when compared to the pleasant cave environment. Maybe we should stay a little longer in the cave, until nighttime maybe, Finn, who suffered more than Seth under the heat, suggested. No. Chapter 66. Experimenting. In the small cocoon, maybe the size of a handball, was a small baby Ivisor. It had felt the warmth of the sun for the first time and promptly heard someone talking of taking it away from it again. It collected all its power and gave off a weak telepathic shout of disagreement. Its weak and soft voice startled its carrier and the evil witch that wanted to take the sun away from it. I guess it can hear us? Hey, little one, did you listen in on the conversation we had with your dad, too? The carrier asked in a friendly tone. It had. But it was too weak to answer now. You don't have to answer, we can try this. Do you want to be my pet? A small window appeared in its mind. Do you wish to enter a pet contract with Seth Smith? Y/N. Seth Smith, it must have been the full name of its carrier. It concentrated on the Y. Ding! You have entered a pet contract with a baby Ivisor. Congratulations! Ding! Title, Divine Tamer gained. You have entered a contract with a divine race as a pet. Purse +2. Seth felt a connection being established between himself and the Ivisor in the cocoon. He could slightly feel its emotions and needs, of which feeling the sun was an overwhelming wish that was transmitted much clearer than anything else. He also instinctively knew how to call the cocoon back into the pet space. In the pet window, he could now see a picture of the small cocoon and it showed 55% intimacy and 35% loyalty. Looking at the window, he knew that intimacy would strengthen their telepathic bond and loyalty was an indication of their relationship. 30% was the minimum to establish the contract, it was the condition of basic trust and cooperation. If it fell below that, the contract would absolve. 100% would mean that they would protect each other with their life on the line. Okay, how about we stay here for a while and enjoy the sun, before returning to the city? Seth had no problem with staying a little longer if it made the little one happy. Just this small act of kindness already made the intimacy increase to 57%. Fin on the other hand hung her head in defeat. The cute and spry fairy had been overruled by a sparkling fluff ball. She was over 200 years old and knew that she should be the adult one here, but her pride still took a hit. After another an hour in the sun, Seth could feel the cocoon's satisfaction. He tried to call it into the pet space and it readily agreed. He still had the connection from the Ivisor and could feel that it was now fell into a satisfied sleep, within the pet space. With the golden ball stored away, they returned to the palace. They all returned to the palace, where Ikram joyfully welcomes them. They had been worried when they did not return from the dungeon for several days. The poor palace chef suddenly had to improvise a small feast for the gluttonous smith and fairy. The missing servants had been replaced and a new head butler was hired. It came out that Ruslan, who had turned into some kind of vampire, had also embezzled the wages of the killed servants. The money had not been found yet. Maybe it was in the dungeon? The guild had concluded their investigation of the dungeon at this point and found it dormant without a dungeon master present. The decision to ultimately destroy the dungeon core and close the dungeon was still pending. After a satisfying meal, Seth and Finn were happy to get back to their room. It was a divine feeling to rest on a soft bed once again after sleeping on the cave floor for a few days. At least for Seth, Finn had used him as a bed, so she could not complain a lot. They fell asleep the moment they touched the bed. They slept all the way to the morning of the next day. Finn was still asleep, so Seth took the chance to have a long bath and wash up. He also shaved the stubble that had grown during the time in the cave. He had been shaving regularly since they stayed at the palace. When he finally left the bathroom, all squeaky clean and ready for the day, Finn was also awake and they had breakfast together. Seth could no longer wait and promptly entered the armory after breakfast. It was time. He had 30 finished blades that waited to have their crossguards and handles fitted. Ding! You have finished your first enchanted weapon. Dex +1. Enchanted longsword. Uncommon. Damage, 200. 1 increase damage by 20%. Mana cost, 15/minute. An enchanted longsword made from high-quality materials by an aspiring blacksmith. The enchantment is a little rough, but functional. Blacksmith increased by 5% with just one sword. But what he did not expect, was that enchantment also increased a slight bit, with the completion of the weapon. There were little effects that improved the time he needed to fit a good handle to the sword, so he needed almost 3 more days to finish all 30 swords. This brought him to blacksmith, apprentice, leave 8, 63%, and enchantment, beginner, LV4, 75%. Seth let out a relieved sigh and sat on the floor of the armory. Looking at the 30 swords resting on the weapon racks filled him with pride and wonder. He made these. It was him. Seeing his works neatly lined up gave him a completely different feeling than just seeing a stack of weapons in the inventory or scattered around in a room. Of course, these were not the only things he finished in this time. He had also experimented with some things for his own use. Enchantment working with engraving or inlays were not permanent but needed the supply of magic power to work. As such, there was the option to use minerals like gemstones or magic cores to store magic as a supply for the enchantment. This was one of the things Seth had tried. It was nothing hard. He used a ruby the size of a fingernail, harvested from the jewelry before, and embedded it into the crossguard of a sword, to see how it worked. This actually gave him some proficiency in goldsmith. It was an ordinary ruby and could only store a small amount of magic. Still, it was enough to try it out. Contrary to his expectations, there was not an automated process. Similarly, to using one's own mana, one guided the magic power from the stone into the blade. So as long as the power reached the circuit, it worked. The second thing he tried was enchanting one of the spare longswords with an infused soul. Enchanted Superior Longsword. Uncommon. Damage, 180 to 220. Durability 1100. 1 unless supplied with magic power, the damage will randomly jump between the two values. Mana cost, 10/minute. A good weapon made by an aspiring blacksmith. Despite minor deficiencies in the workmanship, this weapon shows a slightly improved performance owing to special treatment. The outcome was a kind of a failed product. What happened was that the enchantment on the blade worked for a moment and then started flickering on and off without Seth doing anything. The system did not give him much of a hint, but Seth inferred that the soul he had infused was not strong enough to permanently supply the circuit. Now, the circuit automatically sucked up the magic power the moment the soul regenerated enough for it to work. As Seth sat there in the armory, he thought about soul infusion and the perk list. If only he could see what future perks his skills had. But there was a hint in the description of soul forging, and that was that it needed soul infusion leave 3 to infuse equipment made of souls into items. So, there might be a change on the third level. The question now was, should he splurge a little? He could either use some of the now 87 small souls to try and level soul infusion, or he could use his free SP on the skill. Seth didn't have much time left. In about a week they would have to leave Hike to travel to Orote and take the airship to Orote. On the other hand, Soul Smithy had unlocked the next level and he needed SP to level it up. The time or Soul Smithy. Thinking back, it had not taken a lot to get soul infusion to leave too. Seth decided that the SP was too important for now. He also had a promising idea of what he would make to save time. Back to the roots, Seth made small throwing knives. Yes. The same one he did at the very start of the journey. And he infused them with a small soul each. High quality throwing knife. Uncommon. Damage, 25 to 50. Durability, 150. Throwing knives made by an aspiring blacksmith. They have a great performance thanks to special treatment. Targets better dodge, even the blunt end will hurt. 50% chance to cause bleeding. After 25 throwing knives soul infusion leveled up. And he was right. The perk for Leave 3 was Leave 3 strengthen or upgrade souls by consuming souls of the same grade or size. He tried several things and found out that it had no restriction. He could fuse 2 soul, small, or fuse another soul into an already finished weapon. And after fusing another 4 small souls into the sword, the enchantment stayed activated permanently. Enchanted Superior Longsword. Uncommon. Damage, 220. Durability 1100. A good weapon made by an aspiring blacksmith. Despite minor deficiencies in the workmanship, this weapon shows a greatly improved performance owing to special enchantment. Chapter 67. Revisit. Seth experimented a little more and guessed that he needed 10 to 20 small souls to change one into soul, medium. What did not change was the rating. Even these medium souls were rated as common. This meant he probably could not make uncommon souls from common ones. He could think about it all day and get nowhere, so he just tested around and soon found a clear answer. He remembered that the vengeful soul in his bow had been small, so he simply started infusing souls into the bow. He could feel the energy in the bow grow, but only after 13 souls did the description change. Vengeful Hunter Bow. Unique. Damage, 180. Durability 1000. 1 arrows shot with this bow show malice and will correct their trajectory to hit vital points. 2 inflicted wounds will hurt more, heal worse, and have a high chance to get infected. A frightening weapon made by an aspiring blacksmith. A bow possessed by a malicious will to hurt its benefactor's enemies. Usage condition, Seth Smith. 13. About the number, it would have needed to make it a medium-sized soul. The slightly in the correction of the trajectory was missing and the damage had made a leap. This was when Seth realized that he actually needed to hunt more and bigger prey. It would take ages to get enough souls if he wanted to keep upgrading his equipment. He would need another 100 small souls if it took the same number of medium souls to make it a big soul. And this was only his bow. And this also meant that he needed other uncommon souls if he wanted to increase the rating. He could not fathom the number of souls he would need in the future. But it also meant infinite potential. Not only could he mix methods of enchantment, he could also add the effects of souls. And this didn't even account for the stuff he would be able to do with soul forging. He kept dreaming of the future for a little longer and then got back to work. He had not much time left and there was still a lot to do. 50 spears and 30 simple armor sets would be a crunch to make in just a week. Good thing he did not have to make the spear shafts himself. He had ordered 60 at a local carpenter. An extra 10 in case something went wrong. He never made spears before, so he was careful. He had talked with the Lord about the spears and the spike he had seen on the market. The Lord had explained that these spears actually 2 tips. One was a leaf-shaped spear tip and a spike to balance it out. Seth liked the idea and did exactly that. He made 50 spikes on the first day and 50 spear tips in the next 2. The sockets of spear tips were harder than Seth had expected and cost him some time. He finished the 50 spears on the 4th day and reached level 9 in Blacksmith. The cocoon had actually slept this whole time, except for putting it out in the sun for an hour a day. Seth actually didn't know that the little Ivisor had also spent some time observing him intensely working in the smithy. It was very impressed as it watched the metal changing its shape under the hits of the hammer as if it was clay. It was an almost magical sight. Unknowingly the intimacy had climbed to 60% and the loyalty to 40%. It had taken a liking to him. Now Seth looked a little down. He had miscalculated the time he would need. His unplanned trip into the basement and the days they spent at the dungeon had not really helped either. An encouraging feeling suddenly entered his mind and a golden ball fell out of the air in front of him. The small Ivisor actually tried to cheer him up. Seth smiled. At first, this connection had been a little strange, but he also took a liking to the fluff ball. Yeah, so what if he did not finish the armor in time? He had not really set a deadline for when the stuff should be finished. A big weight fell off his heart. He could just finish the armor sets later and send them here via the church. At least that was his idea. He would have to talk it over with the Lord. But the Lord had been very accommodating until now. The Lord actually had a big smile when he heard that Seth managed to finish the weapons in such a short time. And his face lit up even more when Seth told him that he had to leave soon, but promised to make the armor sets and send them over later. That sounds like a good idea. Do not worry, the armors of our guards will still hold for some time, the weapons were the important ones. I can thank you enough, please travel with a clear conscience, the Lord assured. Finally, this blacksmith left. The food expenses had shot into the sky since Seth stayed at the palace. It was heaven-sent news that Seth would leave and make the armor sets somewhere else and stop emptying their pantries. After he settled the matter with the Lord, Seth felt a lot more relaxed. Fin had been very bored in the last week, but she still preferred this to dealing with her people and duties. She happily flew around Seth when he found her in the palace gardens. It was a lot earlier than when he normally stopped working. Seth told her what he had decided and spoken over with the Lord. And Fin was glad he had not forgotten their deadline. Seth's decision meant they would be able to set off soon. Fin had already taken care of their traveling preparations. There is still one thing we need to do, though, Seth said ominously. What? Fin asked interested. She hoped it was something fun and not Seth locking himself in the armory again to make an item. Get the rest of my payment, of course. The fairy had a bright smile. Something fun. The guild still had not made a decision concerning the dungeon under the palace and no adventurers were allowed to go there. Was it illegal to enter the basement dungeon? Maybe. But Seth still had the keys. So, technically, who could stop him? One fairy and a blacksmith simply passed through the servant quarters as if they owned the place. The place was a lot livelier without some evil creature feeding the people to a dungeon. The party came before the basement door. There were no guards or anything. Seth simply unlocked the door as if it was his home and they entered the basement. Nothing really had changed from the first time he entered. This meant the doors had actually regenerated since then. Maybe the traps, too? Seth would gladly take on another donation of material from the dungeon. Fin's light easily illuminated the long corridor with many doors before them. So, this was your first dungeon? Fin looked around interestedly. Since dungeons could grow literally everywhere, most of them were quite unique. Seth had told her what had happened before. The first few rooms they checked were the same as the ones Seth found the first time. Rotten food, old furniture. The rooms with the broken weapon were empty. These were probably the rooms of the original basement. As they went on, there was a distinct difference between Seth's first experience and now. The path was a lot shorter. There was no almost unending hallway with doors that turned into an earthen tunnel at some point. There were a lot fewer doors, the rooms were empty and there were also no traps. That had all been the doing of the dungeon. As it was dormant now, they had no problems at all and soon stepped into what had been the boss room. The wide earthen cave with roots hanging from the low ceiling was still the same. In the middle was a small pale glowing bead, the dungeon core. The corpses had vanished, the dungeon master had vanished. There were also no old weapons. It was completely empty, except for the dungeon core. What now? We found neither the weapons nor the money Ruslan supposedly might have hidden here, Seth spoke out his thoughts. Haha, do not worry. Leave it to Finn. The little fairy flew towards the dungeon core and struck it. Then it put one arm around it and poked it with a finger. Listen here, you lil shit. We cleared this dungeon fair and square. You owe us. You better rake over the dungeon reward we deserve. You don't wanna know what I will do to ye, if you don't. You heard me, right? Was she, mugging the dungeon core? Would this even? Last warning. With a bright light, several wooden boxes and a small chest appeared around the dungeon core. There we go. Wasn't that hard, right? There were 8 boxes filled to the brim with old, but intact weapons, 3 boxes of armor, and 45 gold in the small chest. The two stashed away their rich booty and ran off, leaving the broke dungeon core behind. Chapter 68. A good read. Oh. Seth. There you are, a haughty voice with a tint of friendliness called out as they returned to the palace. It was the diabolical-looking, but not so evil wizard Megiddo. I have what you asked me for. I already had it the last time I visited, but you were on your little excursion, I mean dungeon dive. Some weeks ago, Seth had asked the wizard who kept traveling between Orote and Zhike to try and buy him a skill book for the skill Akram had mentioned. With this, he would finally be able to read the books in the library. This was also an investment for the future. If Seth was to interact with people and customers that came through the pathwork, he needed to be able to read foreign written words. Even within Earth, there were different languages and alphabets in use. A modern world had no unified alphabet. What would the cultures from more medieval or savage worlds look like? In his hand appeared a scroll with a weak yellow glow. Seth's face lit up while Finn looked questioningly at his joyful expression. They entered his room and sat down around a table. Is this? Seth wanted to grab the scroll the wizard had put on the table, but Megiddo pulled the scroll away from Seth's grubby hands and gestured with his empty hand. Yes, it is the skill book to learn universal translation. You owe me 47 gold. Seth sighed. The wizard was friendlier than he looked, but he still knew his priorities. He counted the gold coins and put them piece by piece onto the table between them. Only after he was done did the other hand it over the scroll. Ding! Would you like to learn universal translation? Y/N. Of course, he accepted it. He had waited several weeks for this. Now, he only had a few days left to scour the library for information. He felt a small headache after confirming his decision and the skill appeared in his skill window. Passive skill, Universal Translation. Automatically translates all commonly spoken and written languages presently registered by the system. Seth was a little flustered reading this explanation. Wasn't the system already translating spoken words? When Seth asked Finn about this, he found out that this only happened for foreign visitors. Natives kept their language barriers. Only by traveling through the pathwork were you installed with the translation software for the world you traveled to. Upon Seth's argument, that this seemed really random, Finn only nodded and told that this how it was. It also did not work for entities not registered as players by the system. Seth didn't feel like thinking much more about this, he now had the solution. Who cared about the specifics of the problem? He thanked the sinister wizard for his kind help and Megiddo left their room. Finn and Seth decided to depart on the day after tomorrow with a merchant ship that would travel down the river. Not as guards, but as passengers. The ship had its own adventurer team from Orote guarding the journey. The tickets were not cheap with a price of 2 gold, despite the ship being empty. The vessel originally transported important supplies to Zhike. The costly price was thanks to the team of high-level adventurers hired for protection. Their work did not become cheaper on the way back. Zhike had no wares worth trading in Orote, so the merchants brought in passengers as a way to cover the costs. Although pricey, it meant they could relax on this journey. Others would take care of the troubles that came up along the way. Seth spent the time until the day of departure in the library. To his dismay, the book Ikram had told him about, gave him little of the information he was looking for. But it gave him some insight into the structure of classes. The system had given him a rough overview of what was important to him at the start, nothing more. The book listed all classes from common to epic. The higher the rating, the more skills the class offered and required. An interesting thing he noticed after skimming through the book for a while was that many uncommon or rare classes were specializations of common classes. Many classes had requirements that mentioned other classes and their skills. A fighter could specialize and become an uncommon swordsman, and if he had a talent for magic, become a rare magic swordsman. Under the right condition, a swordsman or a fighter can also become a knight and rank up to paladin. The structures of these regular classes did not seem too rigid, leaving even people with a common class many opportunities to attain greatness. Seth had some conjectures after reading the book for some time. The higher the class's rating, the more special were the requirements to get it. He knew this because the book mentioned it as an intro to the few epic classes it listed. There was little known about the requirements of most epic classes, as the circumstances of people varied greatly. There was almost nothing known when it came to legendary or mythical classes. They existed, but no information was disclosed. The most interesting to Seth was the explanation of unique classes, obviously. They were special. In general, they were an amalgamation of skills someone amassed separate from their class and incorporated them into his class, in a way that the system acknowledged as its own class. But this also meant that unique classes were not guaranteed to be overwhelmingly strong. Not like epic or above-rated classes were. To be the originator of a unique class, one needed to be a genius or a nutcase of the century. Seth thought of the berserker fairy he left behind in his room. Genius? Nutcase of a century, yet. He also found that most classes worked on the same structure. All classes had primary skills that had more ranks and greater growth potential. One class primary skill could also be a secondary skill of another class. This created the conundrum that two people with different classes but the same skill on the same rank, could have a vastly different performance. If Seth compared this to himself, this meant weapon mastery was a secondary skill, that's why it was missing the apprentice rank. So, if he met a martial artist who had it as a primary skill, Seth would be weaker, despite the skill having the same rank. The same counted for any fighter class with a specific mastery skill. This was almost like a trap set by the system for people to feel overconfident in their skills. Based on the primary skills, classes had dependent skills. Looking at his own skill, it was skills like spirit forging or blueprints. Their rank rose with Blacksmith, but their level is independent. He finally put the book down. That was all he could infer based on his own skills and the superficial descriptions in the book. He looked at the rows of books on the shelves. He still had time, it could not hurt to read a little more. Chapter 69. River Tour. Seth spent the time until their departure collecting information on the continent. He had roughly known the character of this place after he had talked with Simon, the priest from Starta. However, the church did not give him a lot of info up front. After reading and skimming through a bunch of books in the library, he had a better idea of the place he had entered. The books helped him to fill his map with names. The world was called Nemea, and as Sir Nobolk, the Ivisor had told him, roughly 500 years it was almost destroyed by a war between the gods. That was when the system intervened and the Krina Empire entered the world. The small continent he was currently on was one of 3 and was called Krina, after the empire it belonged to. The other 2 continents a mess split between local factions and people from the pathwork. Krina was a giant landmass spawned from the volcanic mountain range spanning from the northwest to the southeast, effectively splitting the continent. The dwarves and humans shared the continent, while the former preferred to stay along the mountains and within their subterranean cities. Ora was one of 3 big dwarven cities on the surface at the foot of the mountain range. The desert to the south of the continent was their current position. The linear distance between where Seth and Finn had landed and Ora was almost negligible if one ignored the giant mountain range in between. The airship they would take in Orote would need to circumvent the mountains by flying along the shores. There was also a big island to the east called Quindle, which was the territory of the elves. Seth had originally planned to travel there after he was done in Ora. Obviously, if you enter a fantasy world, you would also want to see the beautiful elves, right? And they might have special materials or enchantments Seth could acquire. Now that their journey was close to being back on track, Seth could finally think of his original plans again. First, they would get to Ora. And once he had sucked the city dry and grinned out everything he could go and visit the elves. And then return home. After reading the stories of Namia's entrance into the system, he was sure that there had to be groups of surviving and whole cities who managed to cope with the situation. As magical as the territories of the Krana Empire were, nothing beats being a rich weapons trader, lazing around in a comfy modern home, and playing video games. In the best-case scenario, he could even get Finn to stay with him and play coop games. The small Ivisor gave him a mental nudge. How dare he exclude it from his future dreams? In the past few days, the small guy and Seth had hit it off well. They kept sitting in the sunny library and Seth told it more about the continent and his own world. It had inherited its racial memories, but this did not mean it was not eager to learn more. It listened to Seth with great interest when he told it about megacities with millions of citizens, devices to drives around in with high speeds and buildings so high they touch the clouds. The loyalty had increased to 50% and their intimacy reached 70%, they had become good friends. Finn was a little jealous of the time they spent together, but she found the library to be a terribly boring place. Another gain from all the reading was, that his int finally increased to 20. He had not many skills that actually needed mana, but it did not hurt to have more. The only difference he felt from the increase of intelligence attribute, was that he could memorize more information faster, than before the system. Seth. We have to go, Finn flew into the library. All their things were packed and stored away in their inventories. They just needed to farewell to the Lord and Ikram. They also make a stop at the guild, where they met not only Asso but to their surprise Yudrid, too. They said farewell to Olivia, Mary, the lizardman, and the dwarf and went off to the harbour. The active harbour was close to the commercial district opposite from the side of the old district. Here the wall of the city was in better shape and the portcullises were intact. This was the place the river exited the town. Their ride was the only big ship tied to the quay wall. Its flanks were covered in steel plates that protected the wood from the smaller monster of the marshland. The vessel was wide with little draft, so it could travel through shallow waters. They were greeted by the happily smiling merchant. He was big man with a bushy black mustache and wore robes in light colors made of thin flowing cloth to stay cool in the marshland's hot and damp climate. After a warm welcome he led the party onto the boat and showed them their cabin. On deck they met the adventurer party tasked with the protection of the vessel who introduced themselves as the B-rank party Star of the Desert. They were made up of 4 B-ranks and their leader an A-rank adventurer. This meant all of them had a higher level than Finn, with their leader beating her by almost 20 levels. Seth and Finn relaxed a lot knowing this, and if they really came across a problem these guys could not deal with, they were most likely doomed anyway. Soon the ship set off. Finn and Seth stayed on deck to watch as they passed the river gates of the city and finally left Shike behind them. Down the river into the marshlands. These wetlands were just as, if not even more dangerous than those on their way here. When left the city behind, the 2 magicians of the B-rank party took action and cast a cognitive inhibition spell on the boat. Only a few beasts even reacted when they slowly passed them. It was unexpectedly nice to be able to travel along the river without fearing an attack. It felt more like a safari tour. The terribly giant hippo creatures, Magna Buzzy, they had met before reaching Shike, were swimming in herds some distance away. They also saw the big versions of the tiny crocodiles. And the creature that had eaten the Magna Buzzy. Lying in the sun on a dry hill sticking out from the surrounding swamps was a gigantic reptile. Not as big as the Titanoboa matriarch, but easily overshadowing the juvenile. What he immediately thought of were the giant monitor lizard coined with the name of dragons. That's a swamp drake, said someone from behind. The leader of the B-rank party had approached them. It was a man in his early 30s. He had short blonde hair and wore tight-fitting leather armor. He had seen them stare at one of the most dangerous predators of this region and wanted to preemptively tell them. If one of them had used a skill like observation on this beast, it would easily kill them all. A swamp drake? Is it a dragon race? The leader leaned against the guardrail beside them and also looked into the distance at the giant lizard. No, they are a completely separate species. Within these wetlands, they could even beat most low-tier dragons. But they resemble ground dragons in appearance, that's why they are named like that. The one over there is still young. When they reach adulthood, they can easily hunt the Magna Buzzy. And they never stop growing. So, don't mess with it. He left them a warning and returned to his party members. The blacksmith and the fairy returned to watching the scenery. Chapter 70. Orote. They did well in trusting the B-rank party. These people knew what they did and the journey commenced without any hiccups. The money for the ticket was well spent. During this journey Finn and Seth could be mostly found lazing around either in their cabin or on deck. The little Ivisor especially enjoyed the time it could sun on the deck. Don't misunderstand, Seth also did something productive. Seth checked the contents of the weapon crates they had gotten from the dungeon. He had spent the last days of their stay in hike in the library and used it as a kind of vacation from grinding. Now he was bored and had time. In the dungeon, he had given them a cursory look but did not check them closer. The weapons were intact but very rusty and ill-maintained, the same went for the armor. When he started to melt the weapons down in their cabin, he stumbled upon an unexpected surprise. It was the serpent capeche he had improvised in the dungeon. He had let go of it before he went up in flames. The dungeon must have collected it. The second thing he had not expected was an actual dungeon treasure. Seth had not been to any regular dungeon yet. His first one had just started growing and his second one was kept weak on purpose. Regular dungeons were a lot more like those in the novels he had read. They were supposed to be full of monsters, traps, and treasure chests. Those chests could anything from potions to equipment or even magical items. What Seth found in one of the crates was a necklace. Pendant of the Nightcrawler. Durability, 20/20. 1 HP regen per minute plus 5. 2 night vision. 'Tis but a scratch. You don't need light to find your way. You have a tenacious vitality. It was nothing that gave a great boost in power, but it definitely didn't hurt. It even healed. He tried to scan it, but it did not work. He asked Finn about it and found out that items from the dungeon fell under the category of magically enchanted. So, it was of no use to him, besides wearing it. On that note, he also found out that permanent enchantments like those on dungeon items were quite special. Permanent enchantments were often hard to accomplish, no matter what kind of technique one talked about. It depended on the kind of magic, but the results of permanent effects were weak in general because they would use mana from the environment to function. To permanently impart strong effects onto an item, an exceedingly high skill level was needed to use the required methods. This was why most enchanted types of equipment belonged to those powered by the user or could be recharged after a while. Those that recharged themselves with natural mana were a low form of permanent enchantments. Most magical weapons made by wizards or enchanters actually needed a magician to recharge the spell. This system felt like the printer industry. You could get a cheap enchanted armor but needed to come back to recharge the ink every once in a while. His permanent enchantments might not necessarily strong in the beginning, but Seth liked the idea that he would not need to pay someone to recharge his weapon or armor. They finally reached Orote after 4 days. Orote was situated close to the river delta where it entered the ocean. Their ship moored at the inland harbor at the entrance of the city. The difference compared to Hike was unimaginable. The wall surrounding Orote was easily 15 meters high and snow-white like ivory. The only thing visible of the metropole were the high spires of the palace and noble districts seen on a distant hill. These walls had not portcullis but giant floodgates made of massive steel and, just like the walls, they glowed with various magic sigils. There would be no beast breaking through these gates. The difference between their first impression of Hike and Orote was like night and day. The harbor was busy with life. Where came in and left. Everything was filled with laborers, traders, crates, and bags. The traders in their fine and often colorful clothing stuck out of the crowd like a sore thumb. It reminded Seth of the masses of people in a modern metropole, and all the motivation to leave the ship vanished. Who would voluntarily enter this chaos? A soothing warmth came from the cocoon in the pet space and calmed his mind. "Are you okay?" asked the little fairy and sat on his shoulder. "Sure," he said and meant it. The two had helped calm his mind. There was no need to panic just because of a crowd. With Finn on his shoulder, he got off the ship. They bid goodbye to the adventurer party and the merchant after getting general directions from them. From the info Finn had gathered, the airship would arrive in Orote in 2 to 4 days. Before then they needed to find the company to buy tickets. The inland harbor was close to the commercial district, where also the guild was located. Accompanied by his 2 new friends, Seth lost some of the aversion he had developed for large crowds. The surroundings also helped a lot. He felt like a young boy that had just entered a magical shopping alley. All kinds of shops and stalls displayed their colorful wares along the streets. Their noses were filled with the mouth-watering smells of dozens of food stalls that praising their products at the top of their voice. Skewered meats and vegetables, fried noodles, all kinds of baked goods to go. Seth could not even identify some of the things the customers greedily took from the vendors' hands. The stores to the sides ranged from normal ones like the bakeries, tailors, or shoemakers to the more fantastical ones such as alchemists, medicine, and potion shops. Weapon and armor shops became more numerous towards the guild. There were also bookstores and stalls. Vendors on the street sold souvenirs and jewelry, and as if the packed crowd of people was not lively enough, there were also all kinds of people selling live animals or even monsters as mounts and monster eggs for pets. And there was much more Seth did not see or recognize. He would have taken them days to thoroughly explore just this street. Not to mention the whole commercial district. The guild was situated close to a big plaza with a permanent market made of hundreds of stalls. Here vendors and adventurers sold their belongings. Cheap weapons and armor for beginner or monster materials from their last hunt. Fake accessories mixed with real ones and watered-down potion among weak poisons. Seth let out a gasp of relief as they finally stepped out of the crowd in front of the Adventurer Guild. This place was a little quieter, as adventurers only enter or left the giant guild headquarters. Even if the building in Hike had been well maintained and on the height of its time, the one before them was another step up from there. The guild building towering over them was 5 or 6 stories high with many extravagant decorations and statues adorning the facade. The guild had money and meant to show it to the people. Seth felt like he had stepped into an grand train station or an airport terminal. The entrance hall was wide and the opposite side was filled with counters and receptionists. And filled was the hall with rows of orderly lines of adventurers waiting for their turn with a receptionist. But it did not leave behind the traditional setup of a guild. There were a big restaurant and bar to the right of the entrance hall. To the left was a cafe with several open stories looking down to the entrance hall. Here adventurers could sit down and talk to a guild employee or among their party members. The floor was a dark brown hardwood while the walls were either covered in a warm light brown wood paneling or painted in a decent cream color. The wooden counter had brass accents and was reminiscent of old bank counters with metal grids between the receptionist and the customer. The only thing this place and the branch in Hike had in common, were the uniforms of the receptionists. Seth lined up at a random line. The receptionists were good in their job, they handled the requests in a fast manner and the lines before them shrunk fast. Within 10 minutes they reached the counter. The lady greeted them with a well-trained business smile. "How may I help you?" Chapter 71. Arrival. "Hello. We just reached Orote and wanted to ask for the general information about inns, dungeons, and what else would be important to know." He put his adventurer card into the tray on the counter. She checked his information and was mildly surprised that he was an Orihuma. A C-rank human and a B-rank fairy traveling together would be an odd pair anywhere else, but Orote was the hub of many races. C-ranks were quite common in Orote and B-ranks were not rare, so their strength was no big thing, either. People like Seth were a common occurrence, so the guild actually had brochures for new or traveling adventurers to save time. The receptionist put a small booklet into the tray, together with Seth's guild card while explaining. "This is a brochure printed by the guild. It lists all the dungeon with their specific information you can find in Orote. There is also a list of inns and shops the guild advocates to new adventurers and explanations to most public facilities in the city. Here you go, with this." She spun the tray so Seth could pick up his things. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Seth shook his head. "Great. Please have a good day. Next." With the little booklet in his hand, Seth and Finn entered the cafe to the left of the hall. Looking at the menu, Seth was glad he could actually read what was written here. Some of the things were definitely not safe for human consumption. He ordered 2 cocoa and started reading the brochure. First were the dungeons. Orote had 5. 2 were caves outside the city. 1 had grown in the sewers. Was this a kind of standard? The 4th was a portal leading to an alternate space located in the middle of a square in the city. The last one was a tower dungeon. It had 5 stories above ground and an unknown number of basement floors, with the level of monsters increasing the lower one got. The booklet mentioned several inns of ranging prices for any adventurer, whether they were poor newbies or people ready to pay extra. They did not plan to stay long, so they chose a moderately priced inn close to the guild. Well, it was moderately priced for Seth McMoneybags. 10 silver a night was considered pricey even for a good C-rank party. Other explanations concerned different shops where to find system institutions like the bank or the auctioneers. The booklet recommended the different shops for adventurers of different levels, but 2 names always mentioned were the Arcane Emporium and the Desert Dragon Pavilion when it came to weapons, equipment, or materials of any kind. Those had to be the big hots in this business. Seth wanted to visit at least these 2 before they left. The location of the airport, where the airship would dock, was also mentioned in the booklet. It was not too far from the commercial district, so they could walk there today, after booking a room at the inn. The inn was quite luxurious and clean, but it lacked a sympathetic figure like the Harry Harmond. The personal was very polite and distant. It was not bad, but also not very noteworthy. After the days on the ship, Seth and Finn were happy, they could finally wash up in a bath again. Even Finn had gotten used to having a private bath, after living in the palace for several weeks. Even the little fluff ball liked floating in warm water. The little Ivisor had told them that he would probably be able to hatch in the next few days. Maybe they could finally see what a baby Ivisor looked like before they set off on the airship? After washing up, shaving, and donning a freshly washed set of travel clothing, the Lord had been nice enough to lend him everyday clothing during their stay in Hike. He had all his clothes washed before setting off. Looking clean and wealthy, they set off to look for the airport. It was not hard to find. The airport was a big open field with a giant ramp and cranes to move goods onto an airship. After asking around a little in the vicinity, they quickly found out what merchant company was selling passenger tickets. But when they arrived there and stated their desires, "I am sorry, but we are fully booked. There are no free seats for the next airship." "What? How can this be?" "Look again." The tiny fairy swayed between panic and anger. "Ah. Arim, well, that is. It's because there will be a big noble conference in Yisivi. Even the commoner places are booked." Looking at the angry fairy, the clerk feared for his life. Even so, she looked small, she had the aura of a B-rank adventurer, which was like a terrible wild beast to a normal person. Seth held the wild Finn back with his hand and gestured to her to let him resolve this. He said 2 words. "How much?" "Ah. No, you don't understand. We really. How much?" He leaned forward and looked the clerk deep in the eyes. The man shrunk back even more. Why was this calm gentleman almost scarier than that wild beast beside him? "I think you misunderstand how important this journey is to us." His finger drummed on the counter between them. Orote looked interesting, sure. But he didn't want to stay here for another 4 weeks. "How about go and get someone who can make an actual decision?" A stack of silver coins had appeared in his drumming hand and slowly pushed it towards the clerk. "Fear is gone, once bribes were involved." "Oh, of course. I will immediately get you an appointment with Mr. Shirai. Right now." After Seth raked over another small stack, the clerk actually wrote down the current date into a book and went off to tell his boss that he had an appointment today. "See, as long as you throw money at people, they will comply. It's a lot more effective than violence. Please come this way, sir." Soon the clerk led them to the office of his boss. Mr. Shirai was one of the owners of the merchant company and the one in charge of the air travel and logistics. He was the kind of character that perfectly fit the description of a businessman. "Oh, I'm glad to meet you, Mr." The other greeted Seth friendly. "Smith. I am also glad we finally meet," he implied, having waited for the appointment. "Ah, yes. Mr. Smith. How may I help you?" At first Mr. Shirai also said that there were no open seats on the airship. Did it stop Seth? Nope. To cut a long story short, they got a cabin on the next ship for the price of 50 gold. Was it a lot of money? Sure. Was Seth poor? Not really. He could even pay in cash if he wanted to. But they decided to do it via the bank. The money would be transferred after Seth left with the airship. Seth McMoneybags struck again and actually stole the place of a member of lower royalty that would have boarded in one of the later stops. Not his fault, nobility was poorer than him. Seth left the merchant company with a big smile. It was actually quite nice to be rich and throw one's weight around. With this, everything important was settled and the next few days in Orote were pure vacation. Chapter 72. Orote. So, what do you do first when you are on vacation in a foreign city? Food, Seth and Finn said in sync. What followed was a crusade, starting with the street vendors. They did not just eat until they were full. They ate and ate and ate to try every stall they could find. They became a notorious couple of food critics in record time. They had lived the last weeks in a palace. Their palate had gotten used to high-quality cuisine. As such, they showed no mercy when commenting on the food stalls' products. People even stopped walking to watch them as if they were street performers. Despite eating like black holes and trying tens of different stalls, it barely made even a dent into Seth's finances. The food at the stalls seldomly cost much more than 20 bronze coins. After they felt like the body circumference had doubled, they finally stopped. The stalls fought dirty and defeated them with their overwhelming numbers. Finn could not fly anymore and used his pocket to rest in defeat. Seth on the other hand felt like a balloon. He really needed a place to sit down and found an empty bench in a park between the commercial district and the more sophisticated residential area. The weather was nice, the temperature was comfortable and the sound of wind in the trees' leaves slowly made him fall asleep. A short nap could not hurt. "Sir, it's not permitted for homeless people to sleep in this park," a rude voice woke him up. Homeless? Do I look like a homeless person?" "You are sleeping half naked on a bench in a park," the guard standing before him said emotionless. "What? Oh no. Who steals clothes from a sleeping person?" He jumped up and looked around. His necklace, mantle, pants, and shoes were really missing. The guard just merely looked at him askant. "Oh, just you wait," he equipped his armor and looked at the map. One of the map functions that came after he leveled it up, was seeing his party members' position. They just never needed it, since Finn was beside him most of the time. Seth ran off, leaving a perplexed guard behind. In his perspective, a random homeless person just jumped up, wore a good set of armor, and ran off into the night. Not the weirdest thing he ever experienced, but still. When Seth arrived at the position where Finn was supposed to be, he found her sitting on a bloody pulp. Finn had woken up when the evil kidnapper ran off with the maiden, her, in his clutches. Of course, this innocent, young, cute, and fascinating maiden with impeccable charm and manners gave him what anyone stealing a breathtaking and innocent maiden deserves. A good beating until he was close to death's doors, by the said maiden. Seth was a little baffled as this situation somewhat took the wind out of his sails. He was angry, but the thief already looked like he would have preferred to die than to stay alive in this situation. Judging by what was left of his face, he had been a handsome young man. A shame. He just awkwardly picked his things up, but when he wanted to search the thief, Finn has already taken all his valuables. "We should leave now," she said with a brilliant smile. Hearing her voice made the disfigured thief whimper in fear. "Yeah," Seth reminded himself to never anger the little fairy brute. They left the almost dead thief behind and returned to the inn to wash up and rest for the night. On the next day, they went off to explore the shopping district. Seth wanted to visit the Arcane Emporium and this Desert Dragon Pavilion and maybe take a look at the market and other shops. Thinking of the characteristics soul armaments described in the skill description, Seth had an inkling as to what enchantments he wanted to look out for. The cruise with the airship would take several weeks and he wanted to use the time on the ship effectively. Seth planned to prepare as many enchantments to practice with as he could beforehand. Their first stop was the Arcane Emporium. This place also had weapons and armor, but less of the kind the blacksmith was interested in. The Emporium was more specialized in materials and the devices or equipment made by wizards. Seth came here to get rid of all the alchemy materials he had no use for, like the snake organs and the bone powder looted from the skeletons in the caves. There were no shops in Hike he could sell them to. They followed the directions in the booklet and found the Arcane Emporium after wandering around a little. It was a big and imposing building on the main street lined with other expensive shops. Looking around, it came as a surprise that the Red Dragon Pavilion was on the other side of the street, directly opposite of the Arcane Emporium. One had a roof with blue shining shingles and was covered with green jade-like ones. Was there a small rivalry here, maybe? Seth shrugged, at least the way between them was short. He entered the Emporium and was overwhelmed by the interior. Behind the lavish door spread a wide selling floor. The walls were filled with drawers while the room had many shelves and vitrines showcasing everything from equipment like weapons or jewelry to materials or trophies. This place was in no inferior to the guild when it came to the quality of the interior design. Everything sparkled with a magical sheen that stopped people from randomly touching the products. And people there were. Even the wide first floor was well visited. Some wealthier-looking customers could be seen climbing the stair to the next floor. Seth took a look at the equipment but found nothing new. They ranged between a few common and many uncommon items. Most of them were made of high-quality steel and a few were dark iron. The weapons made of monster parts were interesting, but there was nothing past uncommon. Many weapons had magical effects, but not the kind he could scan. The shop did not display any raw materials. It worked on the basis after knowing what you want and asking for it. The clerk would get it if they had it in stock. The main reason he came here was dimmer salts. It was a mineral that was supposed to resemble salt, but it had a light gray to a black color and was needed to create dark steel. Seth might be unable to forge rare materials, but he could smelt them. He was sure making rare materials would help his fire affection to level up. His time in the library was also not for naught. The library lacked specific literature, but he had found a clue to a material that could solve his little equipment problem. Having his clothes or equipment be damaged or melt when excessively used, his fire manipulation was a real pain. Seth looked for either an enchantment to make things fire-resistant or material that was naturally fire-resistant. Obviously, materials like the leather or scales of dragons came to mind. Don't make me laugh. There was no way to get his hand on stuff like that. The next best option, if you ignored high-level monsters spending their life in magma, was the rare material called fire glass. It was a kind of volcanic glass and got its name because of its red transparent color like a clear ruby. Rumors called it the crystallized blood of fire elementals. Finally, Seth, with Finn sitting on his shoulder, stepped towards the long counter manned by many clerks with a professional smile. Chapter 73. The Arcane Emporium. Hello sir, how may I help you? Seth was greeted as he stepped to the counter. First, a little test. Seth wanted to see whether these people were really professionals or would act arrogantly. He put a small portion of bone powder into a small bowl on the counter. He had almost 2 full stacks of this stuff and 1 unit was 100 grams, so he had almost 20 kilograms of bone powder, a common ingredient for many magical professions. It was neither expensive nor rare, but it did not matter. Seth just wanted to see the clerk's reaction. But there was nothing unprofessional, he did neither flinch nor twitch. His expression was friendly as ever as he took the bowl and started analyzing the bone powder. There were differences even in something so simple and cheap as bone powder. Did it come from a fresh skeleton or an old corpse? Was it a monster? Was it in or outside a dungeon? After answering some questions, the clerk offered 10 silver per kg. It was the first time the clerk lost his composure when Seth continued to bring out 20 kilograms. Like this, he added another 2 gold to his stash. This also convinced him of the quality of the service here. Not even once did the employee seem anything other than perfectly professional. The price was also fair. Next, he brought out the various parts of the juvenile he had no use for. Yudrid had written down all the prices of the different organs he should be able to get and the clerk quoted them 1:1 as if he too had read that list. Seth had actually looked forward to being able to haggle a little, but the store paid all the money he wanted even without him asking for it. Finn happily watched Seth making money, while the Ivisor in the pet space found this rather boring. Having sold all the parts of the juvenile he wanted to sell, he was able to store another 15 gold coins. Is there anything else, sir? They had easily spent half an hour on this counter, but the employees were still as courteous as ever. Since we are done with the pesky ordeal of selling, I want to buy. Do you have dimmer salts? The other affirmed and left to get the material. He came back with a bowl of translucent crystals ranging from a grey to almost black color. Dimmer crystal, crafting material, uncommon. Dimmer crystals grow in dark caves and incorporate natural dark mana. These crystals could be ground into the salt he needed to make dark steel. As an uncommon material, they were not too expensive and Seth got 20 crystals for 5 gold. Alright. I am also looking for fire glass. Do you have this, too? Wares of this rank or higher can only be found from the 2nd floor upwards. I am sorry but entry to these floors is exclusive to special clientele. How much? Ah dear customer, I didn't mean. Oh please, when you say special clientele don't you just mean people who don't have to ask about the price when buying stuff up there? Seth pulled out the VIP crystal card from the system bank and the employee's eyes widened. This was a guarantee that he had at least several hundred golds in his account. This should be enough to guarantee that I can afford to go up there, yes. The employee nodded hurriedly and led them up the stairs to the 2nd floor. This floor was smaller, but it held a lot more value. The distribution was similar to the previous floor, just increased by a rank. Everything Seth could appraise was at least uncommon, with most of it being ranked rare. Unfortunately, just like the 1st floor, the equipment was of no use to Seth. At least he could not gain any enchantments here. But he got a few new entries in his material catalog. One armor was made of a mix of dark iron and a bright blue stone that resembled ice. Moonstone, crafting material, rare. Often found among the ice on the tips of snowy mountains or in the depths of lakes that brightly reflect the moonlight. It has a great affinity with water and light. There were also armors made of things like wyvern leather and other materials from monsters. These were not necessarily of interest to Seth, as these things were scarce. It was not useful if he wanted to grind and hard to get if he wanted to use it to make his own items. Metals were of greater interest to him. Blue iron. This iron has absorbed a great amount of natural mana and shows increased affinity with all elements. Seth's window shopping was interrupted by the employee bringing a giant chunk of red crystal from one of the drawers on the wall. It was thicker than Seth's thigh and as long as his arm. The employee was visibly troubled lifting it. Fire glass, crafting material, rare. A crystal often found at the crater of active volcanoes. Can also be mined at dormant places of volcanic activity. High affinity with the fire element. Oh yes, this was it. Even as the color really was up to his taste with its flamboyant red, Seth really looked forward to what effects an armor made from this would have. I take it. Oh my god. What a cool stone. I want it, a young man maybe 14 or 15 years old called out from the other side of the room and pointed at Seth's fire glass. He ignored the snotty brat and waited for the employee to release the theft protection. He gave the employee price of 40 gold coins and stored the material in his inventory. Imho. Did you already sell the fire glass? A strict-looking man in a stiff robe entered the scene. Behind him stood the little brat from earlier. I knew it, Seth thought with a satisfied smile on his face. The deal was done, the material in his inventory and he would definitely not take it out again. Manager. Yes. Yes, I just sold it, he said with a business smile. The young man looked shocked at him and the manager had a complicated expression. But. I want that crystal for my room. Give it to me, he said and turned to Seth. Finn balled her tiny fists and was about to say something, but Seth simply ignored the whole situation and turned to leave. Customer, please wait. No, it was Finn denying the manager's call, Seth just ignored them and left. The brat on the other side widened his eyes when he spotted Finn on his shoulder and ran after them. His uncle followed. I want the fairy. Uncle, get me a fairy, too. Finn on his shoulder froze and the manager's face fell. He roughly grabbed the teenager and covered his mouth. He held him despite his struggle. He's just a kid. He doesn't know what he's saying. Please forgive him, he rapidly spoke in a panic. What was going on suddenly? Looking to his shoulder he saw Finn giving them a deadly glare. Go away, don't let me see your face again, she said in an ice-cold voice. The manager bowed deeply, pressing the brat's head down in the same position. They returned to the shop holding their heads low. What was that? Seth asked once the two were out of sight. Finn has no idea what you mean, she said with an innocent smile. Did he just imagine her expression just now? Yeah, let us not displease the person who almost beat someone to death last night. They crossed the street and entered the Desert Dragon Pavilion. The interior was very different from the Emporium. The floors were tiled with smooth grey stone. Cream-colored walls with calligraphy scrolls and wooden beams and pillars lacquered bright red. The selling floor was filled with weapon and armor racks and a giant shelf with pills and potions towered behind the counter. Here too, was everything covered in anti-theft magic. The interior did not look any less exquisite than the Arcane Emporiums, but it had a distinctly different style. The first floor had many uncommon items, but also common equipment of good quality. Everything had a handwritten price tag. This was a place people with a smaller wallet could come to without being embarrassed for asking a price and not being able to pay it. The pavilion had the same practice of keeping the more expensive thing on higher floors, as Seth could see some wealthier-looking customer entering a staircase. At first glance, it looked a lot more comfortable to Seth. Chapter 74. Desert Dragon Pavilion. The Desert Dragon Pavilion had a lot more items created by crafting classes. Lavishly engraved and enchanted armors, weapons, and accessories were displayed in the store. Despite the rating being lower on average, the things looked a lot more expensive because of the difference in craftsmanship. It was almost a shame that a talented enchanter could take a mediocre armor and take the same price after performing some magic on it as a talented smith who spends an hour on engraving or inlays to give his products a similar effect. Maybe it was just his bias as a blacksmith, though. The first floor held no surprises when it came to materials, just like in the Emporium. The real gain here was the knowledge he found about enchantments. From what he read in the library he knew that enchantments could be roughly split into three categories, which were the basic or simple circuits, the more complex ones, and then there were formations. He found many simple circuits on the first floor. Weapons that would strengthen themselves or the wearer or gain rudimentary elemental damage when supplied with magic. Like their name, circuits implied, these engravings or inlays looked like the artistic version of a circuit board. They were not strictly geometrical patterns like in modern technology, but also served a decorative purpose. Their performance depended on the materials used and the execution of the skill. Their description was something like this. Bow of ice. Common. Damage. 80. Durability 150. 1 deal 5 additional ice damage. Mana cost, 10/minute. A normal wooden bow, roughly enchanted. One could see that the enchantment was done by an experienced engraver, definitely better than his own first try. The simple enchantments on armors could be summarized as strengthening the item or the wearer by either increasing defense, attribute or resistances. Once Seth was sure which enchantments he wanted, he stepped up to the counter. The smile of the clerk was so similar to the one from the Arcane Emporium, that it was almost scary. Especially since they were people that could not be more different. While the clerk in the Emporium resembled a prim and proper servant, this guy had more of a fighter vibe with his wild hair and robes resembling those of the Gadai from Star Battles. "Hello sir, how may I help you?" Even the greeting was the same. The other's businesslike smile turned into a mischievous one as he read Seth's reaction. "Customer must have visited the Arcane Emporium before? I am just imitating their stuck-up behavior for fun. I am sorry if this made you feel uncomfortable. Is this better?" His demeanor completely changed and he started in a familiar, less formal way. Seth liked this more friendly way of speaking and nodded. "Well then, how may I help you today?" Seth listed the items he wanted to buy and the clerk's eyes opened wide. Seth had listed almost 20 different weapons, pieces of armor, and accessories. All of it easily added up to roughly 40 gold. This was no small amount pay on just the first floor. After such a huge purchase there was no problem with Seth entering the second floor filled with uncommon and rare equipment. The things up here were of similar quality to the ones on the second floor of the Arcane Emporium. He found some more interesting materials here. There was a robe made of thin and flowing silk. It was almost see-through and the clerk told him the cloth was as strong as steel. But it was not the main feature. The robe had the effect to harden on impact and block attack like plate armor. The clerk explained that this was not the effect of enchantment, but a perk of the racial weaving skill of the Arachne weavers. No one could copy this skill. There was also an armor made of titanium. Well, not the one Seth knew. Titanium, crafting material, rare. A metal synthesized by crafty alchemists from the blood ore of titans. Effects depend on the blood ore. Seth could guess what the description meant from seeing the armor. It had some unique effects like a huge increase in strength and affinity with the earth element. It even gave the option to increase the wearer's size for a short amount of time. This was what Seth called magic. Among these armors, he found some more examples of complex circuits. They were a lot more winding and maze-like than the simple ones. It was hard to follow their flow like Celtic knots or tribal patterns. These looked also a lot more like decorative engravings or etchings Seth had imagined. Their effects were a lot more varied and abstract. They could not only affect their immediate surrounding but inflict status anomalies like poison, paralyze or fear. He also found mana drain and life steal. A big difference to the simple ones was also that some of these were suitable for magicians and permanent effects. For example, Staff of Toonie Burt. Rare. Damage 120. Durability, 1500. 1 mana plus 250. 2 mana plus 5%. A wizard staff made by a dwarven blacksmith for Toonie Burt. Deals blunt damage in melee. And increase the damage of lightning magic by 75%. There were also anti-magician items with effects like silence, noise, dispel, reflect, and some rare ones that could do damage to attributes like intelligence. Most things on this floor ranged from around 10 up to over 100 gold. Seth only chose a few smaller things. After all, he didn't need the items themselves, only the patterns for the enchantments. 3 daggers, one with poison, one with health, and the last with mana drain. A ring that increased mana by a fixed amount and a small wand that increased mana in percentage. A shield that could reflect the magic and a helmet that slightly increased endurance and could change its size to fit the wearer. The last one actually had a mix of simple and complex enchantments. Everything together he paid another 65 gold. The clerk was puzzled with Seth's choice of items, but it also was not his business what the customers bought. What he did not get to see were formations, but he did not really expect it either. He might have been able to find some on the 3rd floor, but he was satisfied with what he got today. He could not even work with rare materials yet and had spent a lot of money on things he could only use in the future. Seth confronted the vast possibilities of enchantments today and actually feared how many more possibilities there came on the higher levels. He preferred the bliss of ignorance in this matter and decided to leave the Desert Dragon Pavilion for good. Before I leave, do you have any uncommon or rare rated wood? It came out that higher-rated wood was actually quite scarce. Since these materials would need to be harvested from either very special plants and trees or plant-based monsters. Seth realized how lucky he had been when he got the wood of the hunter vine. It didn't mean they had none in the pavilion. They had 2 kinds of special wood in store. Seth would have probably been able to find a greater variety at the Emporium, but the situation there had turned annoying and he forgot to ask. The materials the clerk brought out were ironwood and coal wood. The first was an uncommon wood harvested from trees that grew further inland at the slopes of the great mountain range and got its name from its hardness. It was hard to log these trees, so the supply was limited. Coal wood got its name because it resembled the coal the dwarfs mined. It had a dark grey to a black color and a dull shine to it. It was rated rare and came from the roots of a kind of vine that grew in caves. There was only a piece of each and they were barely big enough for Seth's purposes. Seth purchased both for 10 gold and put them away in his inventory. This was all Seth needed, for now, so they decided to leave. At the door, they were passed by 2 soldiers carrying a young man on a stretcher. Finn's and Seth's gaze fell on the barely recognizable face of the man on the stretcher. He might have been quite handsome before someone decided to rearrange his face and rip out much of his straight light brown hair. Didn't they see him somewhere before? As they stepped out on the street. My son. Oh, my poor son. Who did this to you? They heard a wail from inside the pavilion. They looked back into the shop. To the side, where a door for employees led deeper into the shop, stood 2 city guards with a terribly battered young man on a stretcher. Kneeling beside the stretcher was a middle-aged man with a thin long mustache and his hair bound in a bun. He wore the high-quality version of the clerk's robe. The manager? Finally, they remembered where they had seen that young man before. Seth looked at Finn with widened eyes and spoke with looks. Another? No. The first. Finn had taught the science of both, the Arcane Emporium and the Desert Dragon Pavilion, a lesson. The brute in question just shrugged her shoulders apologetically. They hurriedly left the shop. Although, it was unsure whether the manager's son ever regained consciousness. If he did, they didn't want to be there to be recognized. The 2 still spent some time visiting other shops where Seth bought cheaper, more normal materials he needed in the future. It was getting late and tomorrow was the day of departure. Seth made another tour through the restaurants of the city before finally returning to the inn. Chapter 75. Rank up. It was a bright day and they could see the sea off in the distance from the terminal of the airport. The ship had arrived this morning and was now ready for departure. Seth wore his fresh traveling clothes and a sparkling clean fin set flew around him with a haughty look on her face. They were about to board the airship as VIP with their ticket to a noble cabin. Even the small Ivisor was excited about flying in the sky. The airship really looked like a zeppelin, but only in form. The lower half was made of wood and metal while the upper half looked like a glass dome made of steel and glass. When they boarded, Seth found out that this was wrong. It was not glass, it was a barrier with several segments. One of the segments opened for them to enter. The deck of the ship was a wide, open space with all kinds of recreational activities, a restaurant and a cafe. There was even a pool. It was like a cruise. The cabins were below deck, their VIP cabin was quite big and lavishly decorated. It was in no way inferior to their hotel room in Orote. Also below deck was a casino and a big dining hall with a stage where music was played during the meal times and parties in the evenings. They could also order food to be brought to their cabin. This cruise would follow the coastline of the Nemea continent and had no stops until they left the desert and the mountain range behind them. Past the mountain, it would turn inland. The biome east of the mountain range was a moderate climate with mixed forests. Most of the rich countries and bigger cities of this continent were located here and the cruise would have many more stops. One of these stops would be Orote, where they would leave the ship. This journey meant to be trapped for several weeks on a flying ship with nothing to do but to grind, eat and laze around. It was heaven. Knowing they were among other rich people made the other passengers a lot more friendly and Seth got along well with all the nobles and wealthy merchants. It took a few days of lazing around at the pool, eating good food, and winning some money in the casino to recharge Seth's batteries. He finally had the motivation to start grinding for real. The items he had bought in Orote had long been scanned and just waited to be tested. The smithy was summoned, his mind ready, and just as he wanted to start, he heard a happy twitter in his mind. It was the baby Ivisor. The fluffy cocoon had also enjoyed the last few days on the airship. It loved looking down on the desert and enjoying the sun this high up in the sky. They had almost forgotten that the cocoon was still something like an unborn baby. Now was the moment the little one wanted to hatch. Excitedly Seth ran up to the deck to get Finn, who lazing around on the side of the pool on a deck chair and was leisurely eating a sundae. "It's happening." "What? Weren't you about start forging? The little Ivisor is about to hatch. Come if you want to watch." With that, the two sprinted back to their cabin where the golden cocoon was silently lying on the bed. "Can I start now?" it asked the two via telepathy. Its the ability to talk through the mind had become a lot stronger recently. Their relationship had also seen solid growth and they had become good friends. They heard the sound of something nibbling and saw a small bulge on the golden cocoon. Bite by bite the small hole in the cocoon opened and started growing. Seth's and the fairy's eyes started sparkling as the Ivisor slowly revealed its appearance to the world. How could something that would become an fearsome creature like Serena be this cute as a baby? "Q. Bow to my might, for I have blessed you with my presence." What left the cocoon was a snow-white caterpillar with a round golden head and 3 pairs of big sky-blue eyes. It was about the length of Seth's forearm. Its fluffy, puffy, chubby, and soft body completely lacked any resemblance to an adult Ivisor that gave one the impression of sharp ceramics. "Qoo. Stop looking at me like this. It's creepy." The whined being stared down by the other two. Finn first, she suddenly screamed and jumped at the newborn caterpillar that was still several times bigger than her, giving it a full body hug. "No fair," he said, and pulled both of them into his hug. The little Ivisor was too flustered to react, as Seth enjoyed hugging its soft and fluffy body. "QQ. Stop. Get away from the great me. I am not a tui." They spent some time having fun with the new member of their party until it stopped acting haughty with them. The next thing that happened was that Finn used the moment when Seth was careless and kidnapped the caterpillar, running off to the pool with it. Seth didn't follow them. He had planned to do something before this, so he used this chance to do it. The very first thing he wanted to was to finally craft was Karen's obel. But he could not. The hammer had no fixed material. It was a growth item, but it would start out with the rating of the material it was made of. Seth was so close to the rank up in Blacksmith. He was sure he could make Karen's obel from dark steel as long as he reached Blacksmith, adept. And that was the reason why he started off by making pole arms. Why pole arms? He would gain lots of experience for less work, that's why. He had not made any pole arms before because he had lacked the wood. Now he had 3 stacks in his inventory. Almost 300 ready-made shafts for pole arms bought in Hike. Although the wood was common, the high-quality steel would be more than enough to make the results uncommon. Different kinds of spears, halberds, glaives, warhammers, but the one he liked the most of was the pole axe. It had a spike, a hammer, and an axe blade. It also gave heaps of experience. They were all part of the basic blueprints he had been given at the start, and he followed the same pattern as before. Every time when he started making a new weapon, he would make 1 or 2 prototypes with the help of blueprint and then go over to make a whole lot in free creation. The experience he gained on Blacksmith, Apprentice, Leave 9 for the uncommon weapons he had never made before ranged between 0,5–1%. Seth spent the next 2 weeks making all kinds of pole arms. He would work all day, except when he went to eat, sleep, or have fun with Finn and the little Ivisor. In the end, he had made a little over 150 weapons before finally. Ding! Skill, Blacksmith, Apprentice, Leave 9 has become Blacksmith, Apprentice, Leave 10. Ding! Skill, Blacksmith, Apprentice, Leave 10 has become Blacksmith, Adept, Leave 1. Seth felt relieved. The past 2 weeks had actually been quite relaxed, but Seth was still happy. He immediately pulled out a bar of dark steel and put it in the forge. This had been the whole reason for the last 2 weeks. He pulled the glowing hot metal from the forge and put it on the anvil. He swung his hammer and nothing. The hammer smoothly hit the metal and made a dent into a malleable material. No message that his skill was too low. It had worked. Now he could finally work with rare material and make Karen's obel from dark steel. He had already used the dimmer salts to turn the 3 black iron ores into dark steel ingots. His fire manipulation had actually leveled up to Leave 9 from this. It was late today, so he would make the hammer tomorrow. Seth stepped out on the deck and the cool evening air blew through his sweaty clothes. No matter how often he saw it, the scenery was really breathtaking. The airship was currently nearing the mountain range and the landscape below then had turned from a pure sand desert into a rock desert with many interesting rock formations that threw long and bizarre shadows in the red light of the sunset. And above then on a purplish blue sky, the stars and moon slowly came into view. He found Finn and the little Ivisor sitting in the cafe on the deck drinking hot cocoa and sat down at their table. Seth. Are you finally done? Finn asked joyfully. PFF, done? My skill finally ranked up. It's only the start now, he laughed and ordered hot cocoa, too. They talked until late into the night. The caterpillar had lots of interesting stories to tell. Seth on the other hand had fun telling the two about TV shows and game plots as if they were fairy tales. In moments like these Seth got doubts about ever returning home. Chapter 76. Karen's Obel. It was finally time for Seth to make his own hammer. This was a step any blacksmith would have to make, to really graduate from being a beginner. The process was like a ritual. In the case of Karen's Obel, it really was ritual. The blueprint for this hammer was special. It was not an option he could just click and use to train the process of making a workpiece like the other blueprints. He could only use this once and it had no guiding function. It came with instructions for the assembly and sketched for the shape of the parts. It described a specific breathing technique that had to be used during the forging and the way other materials like souls or candles needed to be placed in a formation around the smithy. He had bought most of the stuff needed for the setup in Orote the day before. Seth not only needed to prepare this setup but had to maintain the correct breathing technique while forging the hammer in free creation. Oh yeah, and he had only one shot to get it right. Everything had to work first try because the blueprint would vanish afterward. He was glad that he waited to do it until now. It was not just that his skill just ranked up, but also that he had gotten a lot more comfortable to just do things in free creation. After making this many weapons in the recent weeks he felt like he was in the best condition he could be in to have only one attempt on this. Seth had prepared 3 dark steel ingots and he decided on the coal wood for the handle. The only ingredient he had that was not rare was the soul, big, from the juvenile. He hoped it was enough to get a rare rating from the start. He didn't know how much material and souls the hammer would need to grow, so he hoped he could save some by starting a rank higher. Just setting up everything took an hour, but the young blacksmith could finally start making the hammer. The first thing he did was welding the 3 ingots of dark steel together to make the billet for the hammerhead. He immediately noticed the difference to regular steel. It was a lot tougher to move and shape the material. Welding them together was a requirement of the blueprint. This needed to happen while following the mentioned breathing technique. Just welding the rare metal together had taken him a lot of energy and brought him close to exhaustion. It did not make it easier, that he needed to infuse the soul into the material at the same time. But he also noticed something unusual. When he noticed it, he checked his status and saw that his mana was slightly fluctuating between full and missing some points. Following the breathing technique controlled his mana flow and sent out a small bit of magic power with every hit he did with the hammer. When the 3 pieces were finally welded together, he took a short break to put some attribute points into strength and dexterity, bringing both to 60 and endurance to 50. He hoped this would help him to manage the next step. Forging the hammerhead. Karen's Obel roughly resembled the other hammers that came with the spirit smithy. One face was flat and square with rounded edges to forge smooth and level surfaced. The other was round and mildly curved to move more material and roughly shape it. Unlike the normal hammers in the smithy, it had steel langets riveted along the elongated handle like some pole arms to strengthen the connection and handle. On top of this, he needed to forge 2 stamps. Seth needed to stamp specific symbols onto the body of the hammer. One was a circle with 2 beads, one at the top and the other on the bottom of it, directly opposed to each other. The other symbol was a reversed V with a small circle fit into the bottom. He had long put his clothes away and his body was drenched in sweat as he slowly forged the unruly metal into the shape he wanted. The only cloth he still wore was a headband that kept his sweat from flowing into his eyes. He had not forged like this for a long time. He lost his sense of time, the doors were locked and nobody could disturb him. His only focus was on the piece of steel that was slowly taking shape under his hands. He drank water and stamina potions in big gulps during the short breaks he took before he kept going. The next step after shaping the hammerhead was the stamps. To save time he used high-quality steel and made 2 square bars where he engraved the negative of the symbols on one end. When he heated hammerhead again until it was glowing red and punched in the reverse V on one side, half the souls that were placed within the formation of this ritual made a step towards him. The same happened with the other half when he punched in the circle. He quenched the hot piece and the souls rearranged again. The 20 souls that had seemed randomly placed at the start, formed a perfect circle around hammerhead. Seth's heart had jumped a little every time the souls suddenly moved closer to him. However, he easily calmed down after reminding himself that this was most likely part of the ritual. Next up was the coal wood. It matched the dark steel not just in color and rating but also in affinity. It was time for the grinding wheel of Sisyphus, and this time he channeled the feelings Sisyphus might have felt. Grinding the wood into shape only worked painfully slow. Despite the potions he had been chugging down, he was fatigued, and his arms felt heavy. Watching the wood be grind away dust particle by dust particle felt as if it was shipping away at his own will. How long had he been working now? He tumbled towards the engraving table with the finished handle in hand. Inlays were also part of the handle. In preparation, he has training making inlays in the pole arms he made. Goldsmith had gained some experience from that. He had chosen ancient bronze for the inlays. They were not categorized as enchantments, but he didn't want to skimp on the materials after coming this far. He felt terrible, but once he sat down at the table he was completely focused again. It took a lot of strength and time to cut and undercut the channels for the inlays. Inserting the wire was the easier part. Not everything was good. The fatigue had its cost, and he often had to fix mistakes and rework the channels for the wire to stick firmly. He had not felt this frustrated, ever since he got this class. But there was light at the horizon. The last step was to smoothen everything by hand with the files and polish the handle. The entire process came finally to an end. He returned to the anvil, where the hammerhead waited. It was time to fit the two pieces. Seth had to grind and readjust a little, but soon had snugly fit onto the handle. Seth had fused about half of the Titanoboa's soul into the head. Now, he infused the other half into the handle. Like before, he could feel that it was a lot easier to infuse the soul into organic material. He nailed on the langets, and with a big sigh of relief, he fortified the connections with a dark steel wedge. Surrounded by a circle of 20 souls, Seth went to the water of sticks. This would completely attach the soul to the hammer and finish the piece. As he submerged Karen's obel in the water, it started glowing in an eerie dark blue, and the souls around him and the materials places for the ritual rushed into the barrel, fusing with the hammer. Ding! You have finished your first class exclusive item. +3 dex +3 str. Karen's obel. Rare, growth. Damage, 220. Durability 3000. 1. The damage is raised in dark places. 2 + 5% dark damage mana cost, 20 per minute. 3. Slow digestion. Like the coin needed to pay the ferryman Karen, to bring the souls to the underworld, this hammer is needed for a soul to find a new purpose in the hand of a spirit smith. Karen's obel is used to directly forge and damage souls. +50% chance to stagger, +10% damage to armor. The hammer grows by feeding on souls and materials. Karen's obel can forge any material but consumes mana corresponding to the change in the structure of anything that is not metal. Only works on the anvil of Tartarus. Other options will be unlocked upon growth. He did it. He did it. He had finally finished his most complicated creation so far. And it had a lot of additional effects. He sat down and leaned against the anvil. All the tension left him and the fatigue kicked in. With a tired smile, he checked the beautiful hammer in his hands. It was so dark, it looked like a piece of the night sky in his hands. Like the portals of the pathwork. Only the dark blue aura along the edges gave it depth. Damage in dark places would be handy in many dungeons. The additional dark damage was also interesting. Dark elemental damage was a kind of undirected curse. It could randomly cause a wound to hurt, fester, rot. You could call it the element of damage over time effects. The cost was high, but the effects were interesting. Slow digestion was a skill that was created by a synergy between the snake soul and its growth attribute. It slowed the digestion of materials Seth feeds the item and in exchange increases the effectivity of digestion and lessens the amount of material he needed by 20%. And the biggest perk would be the option that was unlocked by the higher rating. He could forge any material. The possibilities became endless. He would be able to forge all kinds of monster materials now. Bones, teeth, claws, wood, and all he needed was mana. He looked at his pitiful 200 mana. It didn't matter right now. He closed his eyes and enjoyed the weight of the hammer in his hand, the pain in his arms, and the fatigue washing over him. Chapter 77. Burning Savage. A huge flying creature resembling armored manta rays were circling the zeppelin-like airship in the night sky. A band of burly men in ragged-looking armors and jackets was standing on their backs. The beasts were controlled by hooded riders whose faces could not be recognized. A beauty lifting a sparkling cutlass and signaled the men to attack. She wore a tight uniform resembling a naval admiral that could barely tame her bust, a figure in a warm fur coat on top. In complete silence, the band of raiders jumped off the flying sky rays and landed on the shield dome of the airship. They used devices resembling stilettos to penetrate the shields. Not the shoes, the thrusting weapons. After stabbing into the weapons and the shield started to disintegrate into dust. After each one destroyed their respective segment, they jumped down onto the deck and took out the staff tasked with night watch at the same time. These people looked ragged, but their moves were fast and experienced. These people were no simple raiders. They split up and silently rushed across the empty deck. They secured all exits and left guards before entering the belly of the ship. The interior of the ship was brightly lit by magic lanterns, but it did not impede them in any way. Their movements became even swifter as they took down the remaining guard on the hallways with blowguns shooting poisoned darts. The poison paralyzed the high-level guards who were then helpless against the attacks of the intruders. The poison could not be traced, so it would look as if they died in a fight against overwhelming numbers. They split into two groups. A small team would enter the area with the commoner cabins. The rest would go and actually raid the wealthier passengers and nobles. Their target traveled undercover in one of the commoner cabins. All they needed to do was to stage this as a bandit attack, get rid of that person, kill and rob some nobles, make sure that people saw them, and describe them as raiders. It did not need to be perfect, just good enough to work as an excuse for their client. But not good enough that the target would not understand the message. The senior member would take care of this. Not them. This group of 3 was in charge of being bandits. Everything went great. They could even keep the loot they took from the merchants and nobles. They didn't kill all of them. They had to spare some higher nobility. As for the others, they only killed men and sometimes children. Some women they left behind might wish they were dead. The task was very much to their liking. The 3 of them were new members. They had started off as robbers after their families threw them out during a famine. They had found the perfect job. They loved the easy money and they grew accustomed to the feeling of power you had when you decided over another person's life or death. One day they were approached by an organization that recruited talents like them. They were trained to be even better in what they loved. Everything went great. Their inventories were filled with riches and they had also gotten some action in the last cabin. All these wimps in the expensive cabins lacked the will and the skill to stop them from whatever they wanted to do. It became even easier after the light in the hallways turned off. This meant one of their teams had taken over the bridge. They came before the 5th cabin of the VIP area and it was Frank's turn to intimidate the passenger, while they would search the cabin A and D. Other stuff if there was the chance. He hammered against the door with his unarmed hand. The door stayed shut. He hammered again. "What do you want?" they heard an angered voice. Did they wake him up? They would give him an evil awakening and help him find eternal peace right after. "Room service," he called with an innocent tone, while the other 2 suppressed their chuckle. They had long let down their guard, it was just too easy to loot these people. The door swung open and before them stood a tall muscular man who drowsily looked at the bunch before him. His bulging muscles sparkled with a layer of sweat. He only wore a pair of white underwear and a headband that tamed his unruly hair. What had they interrupted here? The 3 assassins were baffled for a moment but immediately came back to their senses. Frank waved his weapon in front of the man. "Listen here. If you want to survive then bring out all your valuables and..." They were splattered in blood. "Frank," the one in the back screamed. "No, not Frank," said the one catching the body of his best buddy. He wanted to touch his cheek, but there was only a stump spouting a fountain of blood. The young at the door did not even give Frank the chance to finish his sentence. In the hand they had not seen because of the door, he had held a huge raven black hammer. It was still dripping brain and bone fragments of the human once called Frank. He had simply swung it too fast for them to react and crushed Frank's head. Literally crushed. His headless body slumped back, right into the arms of his screaming blood-covered friends. The young man on the other hand just stood there, as if he himself was flabbergasted of what he had just done. Simultaneously, the man in the back lifted his blowgun and shot at the man and a cold glint appeared in the young man's eyes. A greedy smile was the last thing the robber saw before the young man was covered in pale blue flames. The bright light pierced their eyes. The poisoned dart simply evaporated when faced with the roaring flames that suddenly shot out from the door and covered the 2 men. Still holding the fresh body of Frank, the first one could not escape and ended up screaming and rolling on the ground as he was burning alive. The other was luckier. He had jumped to the side and escaped the fire after getting rid of his lit jacket. He looked back and saw the flaming figure step out of the cabin. He swung his arm and the screams of his friend abruptly ended. "No! No! He had to get away. He didn't want to die like this. He had to tell the others. There was a burning savage on the ship. The higher-ranking members had to deal with this. Dash 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 1 minute before. Seth, there is someone knocking against the door. He had just finished his new hammer when the little Ivisor called him from the other room. The caterpillar and Finn had been asleep until now. Finn didn't feel like standing up. The Ivisor let him know. This little. With a lot of grunting, he lifted his tired and overworked body off the ground. His muscles hurt with every move. He dragged his feet and gulped down another stamina potion, though it did not help his tired mind. He heard the second wild knocking. It did not help to raise his mood, so he asked Moody what they wanted. Room service. Oh. Room service? He could really use something to eat right now. Ah. He still had the hammer in his hand. He didn't want to scare anyone. He took the hammer into his left hand. He opened the door and hid the hammer in his left behind the door. In the dark hallways, illuminated by the light from the room behind him, stood 3 wild-looking men in warm-looking jackets and ragged-looking armor. They were not the room service. They had no food. They smelled of blood. Not them alone, it was a smell that wafted in from the corridor. Listen here. If you want to survive, then bring out all your valuables and, he saw it pointed a weapon at his face. Ding! You have killed Frank. Leave 29. Experience gained. His mind was too slow. The decision fell before he could think long about it. The hammer fell before any of them could even react. His left holding Karen's obel swiped up and obliterated the man's head, spraying blood, brain, and bone fragments all over them. Seth was dumbfounded as the limp body fell back and the other 2 started crying their friend's name. This was the first human he had ever killed. This was his first murder. It was different from killing monsters or undead. This man had friends. Maybe he had a family, maybe. Ding. Skill, calm reaction, passive, leave 7 has become calm reaction, passive, leave 8. His mind cleared up and his eyes focused just in time to see the effect of killing someone with Karen's obel. The soul of the victim was directly sucked into the hammer. Did this maybe mean that he did not have to feed it dropped souls, but just use it in fights? Seth saw the man in the back lift a blowgun and reacted with the most natural instinct he had. He blasted them with soul fire as strong as he could. The man holding the dead body had no chance and got covered in fire. The dart that had just left the blowgun was vaporized out of existence. The only thing left of the third was his burning jacket as he dashed off into the darkness. Seth was too tired to chase him and he was assailed by a terrible headache after overusing fire manipulation. The death throes of the man covered in the fire didn't help to lessen his headache. He swung the hammer and the hallway became silent. Another soul was sucked into the hammer. Was it maybe a 100% yield if he killed with the hammer? He suffocated the flames that were slowly burning the hallway and returned to his room. Ding! Title, Burning Savage gained. Your reputation is growing. Plus 5% damage on fire-based attacks. Ding! Your skill, Fire Affection Leave 2 had become Fire Affection Leave 3. Chapter 78. Hunt. Seth was sure he felt a vein bursting in his head. What was up with that title? It was great that his fire affection leveled up, but what was that title? What's wrong? The little fairy asked, looking away with a beet red face. Finn had a hard time sleeping listening to the screams of a man burning alive. She had no problems with the sound of screams in general, but it was just really loud. She decided to leave the bed and found naked Seth all grumpy, entering their room. Meh, it's the system giving me weird titled again, why are you so red? Oh. Give me a second. He put away the hammer in his inventory and entered the bath to take a shower. He felt a lot better after washing off all the dried sweat and wearing a clean set of clothes. There seemed to be bandits raiding our airship, he stated matter-of-factly after leaving the bath. And you decide to first take a shower? Finn asked, baffled. Seth thought for a moment. He really was in a weird kind of calm mindset right now. Maybe it was the effect of calm reaction dealing with the trauma of his first murder? Or maybe the second. Yeah. Do you want me to wear fresh clothes when I'm covered in dried sweat and blood? Finn rolled her eyes. So, what are we going to do? If they kill the captain and the crew, we will be stranded again. Seth nodded. He also was in the mood for a manhunt. Yeah, let's go on a. Maybe he shouldn't call it that. A rescue operation, yes. It's a rescue operation and it was just a bonus that he would get experience and test his new weapon. Yes, we should go and rescue the crew and other passengers. The two robbers had given him 5% experience each. It seemed meager for opponents that were almost 10 levels higher than himself, but it was still rather good compared to the dungeons they had visited. Seth equipped the spare armor, the necklace, and his hammer. The blacksmith and the fairy left their cabin after putting the little Ivisor into the pet space. The caterpillar started off with many skills, but he was only level 1, so these opponents were a little too strong for it. Before they left, Finn showed Seth something laying on the ground. It was a small black cube beside Frank. Finn explained to him that when people who are part of the system died, their inventory would turn into an item box that others could loot. It did not contain everything in the other's possession, but a big part. The 2 cubes he found beside the robbers were mostly filled with money and accessories. After this small excursus they got back to their man who rescue mission. The bandit had run to the right, so that was probably the way they had come from. The two started by checking the cabins on the left. The VIP cabins were distinctly different from the lower-priced ones. They had several rooms and passengers here often had a personal guard that opened the door on their behalf. After describing what happened 2 or 3 times to different high-ranking nobles, an old marquis who was known as a general decided to take over the task of gathering the other passengers here. Once all the VIPs assembled, they had a team of 30 people made up of personal guards. The passengers and 15 guards would hole up here and take in survivors. The rest split into teams of 5 while Seth's and a B-rank party of 3 made up their own groups. These teams would search the passenger deck and send the survivors back here. 20 people were walking down the main hallway that connected the different sections. They would split up along the way. Some people lingered in front of Seth's cabin. The 2 burnt and headless corpses and the singed walls and floor of the hallway were an eye-catcher. The doors of the 4 cabins after Seth's stood wide open. These were also part of the VIP cabins. Everyone looking into these rooms had the same reaction. They ground their teeth and gripped their weapons tighter. The sight was nothing for the weak-hearted. The first victim was always the personal guard lying right at the door. Either their heads were split or their throats were slit. The nobles in the second cabin were spared and only tied up. The rest were not so lucky. There were no signs of mercy. All deaths seemed cruel and accompanied with terror and pain, even the children's. The surviving noble family thanked them and was evacuated. Past these 4 cabins came to a crossing. All sections were along the main hallway and this crossing split off into the 2 hallways that lead to the noble cabins. Further down were another 2 crossings that led to the commoner cabins. The main hallway ended in a staircase that connected to the main and lower decks. One would reach the other sections like the bridge, staff quarters, engine room, and utilities only through this staircase. One by one the groups split off into different sections. In the end, Seth and Finn entered the first dark hallway of the commoner section. The fairy moved her conjured ball of light several meters to the front, so they were walking in the darkness behind the light. This was distinctly different from the other sections. Some doors stood open, with their inhabitants killed, and others were still closed shut as if everything was normal. It was as if someone randomly chose who would live and who would die and killed the unlucky ones like livestock. They did not alarm anyone, yet. It was more important to check the whole hallway in case the assailant was still around. After seeing those scenes in the opened cabins, Seth could feel that calm reaction was hard at work. It was different from seeing zombies or the remnants of battle without corpses. He had not been confronted with how cold the reality he had entered was before. Not as much as now. Life was worth so little in this world. The rage he had felt, the fear he felt in these moments was somewhere under the surface. Not locked away, but only slowly trickling in. He was tired, but these emotions constantly entering into his consciousness kept him on edge. At least the people here died fast, Finn assessed looking at the bodies with either their throats being slit or necks broken in their sleep. This was done by professional killers, not looting bandits. Seth felt conflicted seeing that these people were most likely a lot more skilled than the scrubs that came to his door. He had an advantage in attributes, but if the enemy was high level and skilled, could they take them on? When he thought whether he should worry about the assassins, he saw the tiny back of the serious Finn. Her face lacked her regular carefree expression and was hardened with bottled-up anger. Seth relaxed a little. She was like an anchor, a strong thigh he could hug. It convinced him that whoever those people were, they better worry about getting found by them. Not the other way around. They had not been walking for long when they heard something in front coming closer. Suddenly with unexpected speed, Finn's light ball shot along the corridor, illuminating two silhouettes dressed in similar armor as the bandits at the end of the corridor. The ball exploded in a bright radiance, surprising the malignant figures. It worked like a flashbang and blinded them for the moment. Finn rushed in to get a first shot at the opponent, but the other actually managed to block her tiny fist clad in divine aura, without being able to see her. His other hand was still covering his eyes. Seth flinched. Instead of rushing in, he decided to pull out his bow and give the fairy covering fire. The explosion of the light ball had left the affected area brightly lit, so he started shooting the assassins from the darkness. Quite ironic, the assassins stood in the light, while the blacksmith attacked from the shadows. He focused on the second one, to keep him from interfering with Finn. But similar to Finn's opponent, Seth's was not some cannon fodder. He managed to dodge most of the arrows. Even the ones that arbitrarily changed their trajectory to hit, missed the vitals they aimed for. The assassin, on the other hand, started moving in the direction of the shots and was closing in on Seth. What gave him a little shock was probably that the arrows became harder to dodge in the darkness. Finn needed light to fight, but Seth wore the pendant of the Nightcrawler. He had night vision. Running towards him into the darkness just made it easier to aim for him. This one did not take out a blowgun. He also didn't start to throw shuriken like a ninja. The figure rushed along the hallway brandishing his daggers. Did he think Seth was a ranger or something? Trying to fight him in melee. When the assassin came close, Seth switched weapons to a spear and shield. One might think that a long weapon like a spear had a disadvantage in a narrow space like this, but it was quite the contrary. In this narrow space, Seth could easily keep the assassin at a distance as he had little space to avoid the spear's thrusts. The commotion woke up several of the passengers in the surrounding cabins, who drowsily started opening their cabin doors. The intruder saw his chance. He grabbed a scantily clad, pot-bellied man as a hostage. He held him in front as a shield. "Get out of the way, or this man dies." He had just ended his sentence when the spear penetrated both of them and excited at the assassin's back. Seth let go of the spear and rushed in with the hammer. Ding! You have killed Arthur. Leave 34. Experience gained. Arthur, the other attacker called out. Another soul was sucked into the obel. The hostage looked up at him with shock, his hand placed on the spear that had penetrated his body. You have sacrificed me. Oh, stop the drama, Seth rolled his eyes. He simply put the spear in his inventory and shoved a healing potion into the gaping wound. There, you will survive for now. When Seth wanted to rush forward to help Finn in her battle, he already heard the announcement. Ding! Lance Leave 40 has been killed. You have earned experience. Finn was able to use the distraction of Arthur's death to gain the upper hand in her fight and end it in a flash. What Seth astounded was the overwhelming difference in experience he gained. When he killed Arthur, he got not much more experience for it, than when he killed Frank, about 7%. But for Lance, he got a whopping 15%. As he was wondering why this happened, Finn approached him. Seth. Are you okay? What happened to that guy? She pointed at the man on the ground. She had not noticed him at first. Oh, he was a little in the way. Could you heal him? The man had already taken a potion, so it was not hard for Finn to treat the wound. They explained the situation to the man and other passengers who had woken up. Whereupon they moved towards the VIP cabins and woke up the other passengers on the way. The two searched the item boxes of the two assassins, but they did not drop anything of importance. Their uncommon daggers were the most valuable, but not special at all. Chapter 79. A new quest. Towering over the corpse of one of her own men was the Busta, leader of the bandits. We really shouldn't have brought amateurs on this mission, she said, looking down on the guy who had babbled something about a burning savage or whatever. But boss, it wouldn't be believable, if there were no actually bandits among us. Isn't it fine that some of the cannon fodder died? It just helps to make this look more believable. You are right. The nobles forming a resistance should also be a good excuse to leave now. The target is dead, I assume. Yes. Except for these guys, we only met minimal opposition. We are still missing 2 of our people, but they should return soon. Good. The captain. We had to kill the night shift to take over the bridge, but anyone else from the crew was left alone. The airship will be able to keep going without a problem. All right, it should be enough then. Let us leave. What about those 2? Leave them. They probably met opposition, if they aren't back now. The blacksmith and the fairy kept checking the rest of the hallway, as they had met the attackers about halfway through. Most people here had left earlier. There was no point in silently checking the hallway anymore, so they started actively evacuating the survivors still left. There were only a few cabins left anyway. Finn was just talking to a man in a nightgown when Seth noticed a pale silver shine from one of the last cabins in front. He left the man to Finn and went over. It was not the shine of light. In the middle of the room, above the corpse of a middle-aged man, floated a silver white-colored soul. Loyal soul, middle, crafting material, rare. The soul of a truly loyal person. Even in death, it cannot forget its duty. Wait, this reminded him of... Ding! A quest has been triggered. Quest, a last request. Difficulty, B. You have encountered the tragic scene of someone who failed to protect. Despite the desperate situation, he had not given up. Even after death, his soul still wishes to fulfill his duty. Will you help accomplish his duty and finish his task? Requirement, save Serena 0/1, make sure she reaches Yisivi. Rewards, loyal soul, middle, intimacy with the Count of Zexos, experience. Do you accept the quest? Save someone? Before he decided whether to accept or not, he took a good look at the room. It was not different from the other commoner cabins. A bed, a cupboard, a small table, and a chair. The corpse lay in the little free space in the middle of the room. He could see a little pale girl's hand sticking out from underneath the man. Seth lifted the man up and his eyes fell on an unconscious young girl. Blood soaked her simple blue dress, her curly blonde hair. The attack that killed the man had stabbed through the man's back and into her stomach. Her chest barely moved under her shallow, ragged breaths. Serena of Zexos, leave 4. Status, unconscious, bleeding. Title, Little Rena. Age 7. Class, Noble. Level, 4. Race, Huma. Sex, Female. Health, 245/1000, 5/S. Mana, 55/90. What's up with this quest? Finn asked. She followed Seth after dealing with the sleepy nightgown man and came just in time to see the girl on the brink of death. I just found her, can you heal her? Seth didn't have a problem with accepting the quest if Finn could heal her. The two agreed with a look and accepted the quest. Like the first time, the soul disappeared and Finn started healing the girl. It took several attempts until the wound stopped bleeding. It was rather deep, as you would expect from a stab wound straight through the body. Judging by the bleeding status of the girl, the attack had happened a few minutes ago. They were probably the last people who had been attacked. The girl was still unconscious, so they decided to hurry back to their cabin. The hallway was empty and silent when suddenly the lights turned back on. Had the other groups managed to take back the control? Back at the VIP section, they passed the makeshift guard that kept watch over the section's entrance and entered their room. Most survivors from other sections had taken refuge in the, now, vacant rooms. Others had friends or acquaintances among the nobles here and stayed with them. They put the girl on their bed and locked the door. Soon there was a knock on the door and one of the ship's guards stood before them. The whole passenger section outside had become lively with many people walking in the hallways of the VIP and noble cabins. The other adventurer party from their section had managed to scout the staff quarters and alarm the remaining guards of the ship. Apparently, they and the crew were soundly asleep. The Biranks reported that they had been put to sleep by a poison fog. They only woke up after the party's priest purified the place. With this, the evacuation and search of the ship had progressed rapidly. Half the guards came to the VIP and noble cabins to help protect the passengers. The rest went to search the ship with the crew. They had reactivated the light, after finding the bridge vacated. It was one of the guards that had knocked on their door to explain the situation to them. He knew from the other people, that it was them who had warned everyone. So, he asked Seth what exactly happened and got a rough narration of Seth's evening. Since the place was now teeming with guards, there was no more need for them to help. Seth was not a hero. He felt bad for what happened on the ship, but he was tired and glad that he could simply leave it to someone else. He put away his equipment and wore the simple undergarment of his traveling clothes. The bed was occupied by Serena, so he plopped down on the sofa and fell asleep. Finn was a little worried about Seth's state of mind. He had acted weird after leaving the smithy. The little fairy decided that she could not do much for the young man at the moment, but keep an eye on him in the future. For now, she sat down on the bed beside the soundly sleeping girl. Her breathing had calmed down and there were no signs of her previous struggles left. Watching the girl for a while, Finn also fell asleep. She had used a lot of mana to heal the girl. Seth slept on the sofa, Finn and Serena on the bed. Only the small Ivisor was awake and kept watch over them. Chapter 80. Rena. Serena woke up in an unfamiliar room. She had gotten used to the tiny room she had lived in with Uncle Ben for the last 2 weeks. Uncle Ben had visited them when her mother had become sick. He was a friend of her father and his sworn brother. He had told her a lot of stories about her dad and their adventures when they were still young. Serena had never met her father herself. She had lived her whole life with her mother in a small estate in the grasslands. Uncle Ben told her that her father now worked as the lord of a big city and wanted her to visit him, so he could take care of her. All she knew was the house on this hill and the small village in the distance, where they would go to buy food and clothes. The big city had a great allure to a small girl from the countryside and she imagined all kinds of fantastical sceneries as she listened to her uncle's stories. Still, she had hesitated to leave her sick mother's side, but Uncle Ben assured her that her mother would be all right. He had even brought a doctor to take care of her. She decided to leave with Uncle Ben, only after her mother kept urging her to leave. She had looked desperate and coughed a lot back then. She had a big lump in her throat when she promised her mother to go with the uncle. Tears had clouded her vision when she looked back at her mother one last time. She looked tired and drenched in sweat, but she gave her daughter the most dazzling and encouraging smile she could muster. Uncle Ben had brought her away on a carriage and they soon reached a big city. The sight pushed her worries to the far back of her mind. She saw so many new and fancy people. Ben bought her a lot of candy and food and kept her mind occupied. She felt overwhelming wonder when they came before a ship that looked like it was made of crystal and would fly in the sky. The small cabin she shared with Uncle Ben was underwhelming, compared to the magnificent outer appearance of glory. But they only spent little time here and Serena had a lot of fun exploring the ship's facilities. Ever since she left home, it felt like a magical dream to her, until it turned into a nightmare. Rena. Rena, wake up, Uncle Ben woke her up deep in the night. You have to hide. Listen to me. Hide under the bed and don't come out. No matter what you hear. Do you understand? She drowsily looked up at the serious face. She did not really understand but nodded anyway. Then Uncle Ben pushed her under the bed. Stuck under the bed she slowly realized what had just happened. Uncle Ben looked so serious. He was so strong, were they in danger? Her heart started beating faster and faster. She could not see anything but the sounds became clearer and clearer. And then, in between the overwhelming sound of her own heartbeat, she heard the sound of the door slowly swinging open. She felt Uncle Ben jump off the bed and heard the clang of metal, followed by chaotic steps across the cabin's wooden floor. Another clang, and another. Then she heard a muffled moaning and a loud thud on the floor. Uncle Ben's face came into her view. He laid on the ground in front of the bed and she could hear his laborious breaths. Uncle B, she whispered. Don't talk. Just hide, he pressed out in between breaths. Who's hiding? She heard a strange voice ask. No, Ben shouted. Suddenly Uncle Ben pulled her out from under the bed and took her into a tight embrace. She just heard a ripping sound and a thud behind her. Looking over her uncle's shoulder she saw the dark shadow that had stabbed something into their bed. Please, at least spare her. She is just a child, Uncle Ben begged their attacker, hugging her even tighter. Don't worry. She will live if she is lucky, the man said sarcastically. You have to get to your father, no matter what. Remember this. She heard Uncle Ben whisper weakly beside her ear and then Serena felt a sharp pain in her belly. The pain was too much for such a young girl and she lost consciousness. She woke up lying down on a soft bed. It felt so soft, soft like clouds. She opened her eyes and saw a beautiful room with lavish decorations. Did she die? Did she enter heaven? There was a cute little fairy sleeping beside her on the bed in a slopping sleeping posture, and a big caterpillar was looking at her with 6 pairs of beautiful blue eyes. She heard snoring and her eyes fell on a young man sleeping just as sloppily as the fairy, on a sofa. It probably was not heaven. Angels definitely slept more orderly. Who were these people? Where was Uncle Ben? She remembered what had happened and her heart became heavy. Was Uncle Ben gone? What was she to do now? Reach her father. It was Uncle's last wish. Seth. Wake up. The girl Seth felt a weak tug in the sleeves of his shirt. His eyes felt crusty and rough when he opened them. His full view was filled by a chubby, teary-eyed face framed by curly golden locks. The girl was biting her lips as if she had trouble bringing herself to talk. "Please help me." He could see it had taken her considerable resolve to ask a stranger like this. Serena felt so insecure and afraid. The girl was on the verge of crying after simply asking for help. Doubts kept surfacing. Would they really help her? A big warm hand stroked her head. Seth had no idea how to deal with children, so he just started to pat her head and tried to speak in a soothing voice. "It's okay. You are safe now. We will help you." He felt tired but tried to sound calm and reassuring. Suddenly the girl started crying and threw herself at him. The girl must have been very desperate for an ally. Seth calmly stroked her back and in an attempt to calm her down, but couldn't help but think that this would have been a lot better if she was a mature beauty. "You seem to get along quite well already. Finn wants to hug, too." It was the sloppy fairy that had finally woken up, too. With Finn joining the situation, the girl soon started to calm down. Fairies and little girls were simply a match made in heaven. Even when the fairy was a cute-acting macho fairy. Seth heaved a relieved sigh. When the little girl had finally calmed down and was convinced that they would help her meet her father, she started telling them her sob story. Unexpectedly, it was Seth breaking out in tears after listening to the scene of her leaving her mother behind. The airship soon restarted the journey. The remains of victims were left behind at the next stop and had been stored in the captain's inventory until then. Their kin would be able to retrieve them from there and bring them back. It would take another 2 weeks for the ship to reach Ivisor. Serena was a very bright and kind girl most of the time. She liked spending her time with the Ivisor and Finn. She treated the big caterpillar like a plushie and he let it happen. Sometimes she would also sneak into his room and just watch him forge. Seth was glad that Finn had another person to spend time with when he was occupied with grinding his skills. After finally finishing Karen's obel, Seth was finally able to experiment with his new skill. He was shocked when Finn told him that he had been stuck in his room for 3 days to make the hammer. He had also mentioned the discrepancy in experience he had noticed. Finn told him that the 15% were the appropriate amount, but she had no explanation why he got so little before. The only explanation he could come up with was that the soul had something to do with gaining experience. It must have been because the hammer harvested the soul directly. At least he could not think of anything else. The first thing he tried out with his new hammer was actually not the soul smithing, but the option added with the rare rating. Seth used one of the smaller teeth of the Titanoboa and started forging material he could have only ground into shape before. He pushed magic power into the hammer and started forging the uncommon tooth into a curved dagger. In 15 minutes, he shaped the tooth into a blade. He spent 75 mana, so it cost about 5 mana per minute to forge the tooth material, but an advantage was that he did not need to waste time to heat up the material. Shaping the tooth felt like forging hard stubborn clay, but at the same time, he also noticed that the material changed as it hardened and compressed slightly. In the end, he got 2% proficiency for finishing the Serpent Dagger. Serpent Dagger. Uncommon. Damage, 120. Durability 600. 1 chance to poison target plus 5%, 3 mana/minute. A simple dagger forged from a big snake's tooth using unknown methods. To have a comparison, he made the same dagger by grinding a tooth into shape and he made a comparable steel dagger. The one ground from tooth only had a durability of 200 and gave 1,5%. The steel dagger had comparable performance but only gave him 0,5%. So, the serpent dagger not only gave more proficiency than the other two, but also had better performance since it even had an effect thanks to the material it was made of. He had 150 snake teeth. Keeping in mind that the proficiency gain halved upon level, he could get to Blacksmith, Adept, leave 3 if he succeeded every time. The only constraint now was his mana.